Chapter 554. That night, Dake completed the draw in a daze and immediately fell asleep. When he woke up, his body was covered in fur balls. Taking off the fur ball from his body and putting it aside, he fell into a brief moment of contemplation. 9 days had passed in September, and today was the 10th day. In the first 4 days, he drew 4 points of bliss and 4 points of greed. In the last 5 days, he drew 2 points of pride, 6 points of bliss, and 2 points of greed. There was no purpose in it. It was just that bliss was easier to increase, and pride and greed had more to spare. Unsurprisingly, today was the last day, and he would draw greed again. This way, after eliminating the 3 points of bliss and 3 points of greed, he would have 2 points of pride, 7 points of bliss, and 5 points of greed left. His original plan of researching the 4th great sin had to be put on hold. As the daily draw was reduced to 2 points, the overflow of great sin was clearly not enough, and he would need to add more materials to get it. Remember, https://m Vipkanchu. VIP gradually accumulating bliss would make people want to try making a new Bliss 3. However, after careful consideration, Dake realized that the new Bliss 3 would only bring about a limited increase. The new Great Sins 2 had a huge increase in power because it could provide Ivan with a specific field skill. However, Great Sins 3 would not bring about that. Compared to the 10 points of bliss, the addition of a few killing moves would not change the nature of the skill. Thus, instead of making Bliss 3, he might as well try Pit of Bliss. Even if the Pit of Bliss was only an incomplete version, it still had its meaning. Through many experiments and tests, he could make more improvements and adjustments to the new refining method. Moreover, bliss was the easiest to accumulate. After all, the desire to reproduce was the nature of living things. Dake shook his head and decided to leave it at that for the time being. Then, he raised his head and fell backward in a daze, allowing his consciousness to be drowned by furball. It was 3 in the morning. Beep, the branch card's caller ID woke most of the second-year students up from their dreams. Dake got up and took out the branch card from his card bag. He saw a reward flashing on the card. He clicked on the. It was indeed a new timetable. Compared to last week's class schedule, 2 electives were added to this new schedule. They were Alchemy, by Professor K. Zayer, and Astrology, by Professor Mitya Bartholomew. We're lucky. They're all on Thursday. Dake took a deep breath of fresh air to wake himself up. Starting from the 2nd grade, the students' main classes were concentrated on Monday to Wednesday, while the elective classes were distributed on Thursday to Friday, or inserted in the first 3 nights. He passed the 2 electives he chose without a doubt. Professor K. Zayer and Professor Mitya did not reply to his application. I wonder how D. Anna and Luo C. are doing? With that thought in mind, Dake washed up and applied the facial mask in one go. After that, he changed into casual clothes for morning exercise and pushed open the dormitory door. He looked at the corridor all the way to the other end. Most of the second-year students pushed open the door and walked out at this time. With Professor Cheong Si's physical training plan, they no longer had the room to sleep in. Dake took a deep breath and trotted over. He bumped into D. Anna and Luo C. Did you receive the new timetable? Yes, perfect. Luo C. also nodded obediently. Both of them were indeed students for their respective electives. They signed up early, so there was no reason for them not to pass. I passed too. Eudora, who came out of nowhere, was declaring her presence. Her electives completely overlapped with Dake's. AI Ma and Sarah were the same. However, Dake was more looking forward to being in the same class as the seniors. Professor Mitya's astrology class was not important for the time being. After all, there were other veteran astrology professors in the academy to choose from. However, Professor K. Zayer's alchemy class was unique. If there were any seniors who were interested in alchemy, they would most likely rush to enter. In contrast, the threshold for the alchemy class was raised. Those who did not apply early enough or were not outstanding enough might not be able to squeeze into the alchemy class. Of course, AI Ma and Sarah should not have such concerns. In that case, there would be at least 4 second-year students in the alchemy class. After the morning exercise, Anna applied magic medicine to Luo Si's hands and feet in the bedroom. The magic medicine slowly penetrated into his skin, relieving the soreness and stimulating more strength. After half a week of training, Luo Si's physical fitness finally kept up with the pace of the average person. After that, if he gritted his teeth and continued, he would be able to obtain more than the average person's physical fitness. When Anna was carefully applying the medicine, she complained, "Night class and transformation class, none of them overlap with yours." Luo Si grimaced, "But these are all what you like, aren't they?" "Okay." Anna pouted, "After I learn how to transform into a bear, I will eat you." Haha. Luo Si laughed, "Then I will give you an injection after I learn how to inject." Anna. 3. Lu. Similar conversations sounded everywhere in the castle. Not only the second-year students, but the seniors also hesitated because of the electives. Students always like to be able to take the same courses as their best friends. But after thinking about it rationally, they would realize that they were not suited for the same courses as their friends. It was right to choose the most suitable electives separately. Just like Saraswati and her hardcore friend Heidi Euphemia, they chose different courses. Sarah chose astrology and alchemy, while Heidi chose astrology and medicine. Yes, her and Luo Si's choices overlapped. On the other hand, Dolong Teddy chose night and transformation, which was the same schedule as Anna, White, and Luo Boat. Luo Boat was not selected for transformation, which made him excited for a long time. Dolong's friend, Pitten, chose astrology and evocation, which did not overlap with Dolong's. Evocation was a pure class that taught students how to skillfully use magical power to shape various shapes. It could materialize illusory magical power and give it physical characteristics. Even though the magic hand, derived from evocation, had limited strength, it could be used to assist in experiments. Basic curses such as magic bullet spell could also be simulated through evocation. Students usually chose evocation to train their magical power control. If used in a duel, it would allow students to have an advantage in pulling the magic conducting ball. Of course, there were also students who used it to improve their physique. For example, filling a certain part with a tangible magical power block could make that part look more majestic. Furthermore, a wizard caster could directly shape magical power into the shape of a weapon, which could replace the fantasy weapon spell after increasing its strength. Dake had considered evocation when he checked the elective course schedule, but he judged that he didn't have a huge need for evocation, and he might be able to self-study in the future without classes. And according to what he knew, one of the 2 elective courses that Eve and Aaron chose was evocation. As for the other elective course, it was Magic Play. Its full name was Magic Tricks and Deceit Lecture. This course would taste better when eaten together with evocation. The basic content of Magic Play was to teach wizard casters how to cover themselves with a layer of magical power coating to mislead others' perception of them and achieve the goal of deceiving their opponents. The application techniques derived from this were varied and belonged to the subtle application of magical power. It was very suitable for Eve and Aaron. Professor Shi Erfu finally began the second summoning class of the new semester. As she spoke tirelessly, the little wizard caster's understanding of summoning spells gradually deepened. Professor Ka Zaire also began to explain the theory of magic conduction in depth, gradually unveiling the most mysterious veil of the theory of magic conduction. But because of this, the difficulty of magic introduction increased tremendously. After this step, the little wizard casters who couldn't keep up had to work harder after class. Dake looked at Anna, who was holding her head in front of him, and held back his laughter. Similarly, potionology, in the afternoon, also began to explain the theoretical knowledge of potionology in depth. The little wizard casters had a basic understanding of potionology after an entire year of study. The next step was to analyze the theory and understand the connection and reaction between each type of potion. Gradually, they would be able to analyze the potions themselves and develop potions. This process would continue all the way until graduation. If they could develop more than 10 universal potion formulas and one high-end potion formula before graduation, they could be called a master potionologist. The class time was halved, but the content was twice as difficult. This was a difference of 4 times. The second-year students suddenly looked back and suddenly realized how easy it was for the first-year students. Ring, ring, ring. When the bell for potionology rang, the students quickly packed their bags and rushed out of the classroom as if they were fleeing for their lives. Dake waited until D. Anna and Luo C. finished packing their bags and prepared to go to the club classroom with them. Occasionally, he would hear White and Luo Boat talking about the sports club. However, it seemed like only Luo Boat joined the sports club. Luo Boat was very talkative and excited. It seemed like he did well in the sports club entrance test and was recognized by the seniors. As for White, she joined a club called Marine Biology Research Club. What club is that? Dake tried to recall after the initial shock, but he couldn't find the name of this club in his memory. Even at the club recruitment on Friday, there was no sign of Marine Biology Research Club. A club that doesn't recruit new members. How did White join? Marine biology, wait, it can't be that club, right? Dake suddenly remembered the club where all the members wore marine leather gloves, and his expression became strange. In the end, White Gouda didn't betray the Marine Biology Research Club and formed the Marine Biology Research Club with the members of the club. The Marine Biology Research Club had a lot of members, from the 2nd grade to the 6th grade. Due to the misdeeds of the other members of the department, Werther was elected to be the head of the department. That was why White made up his mind. He would rather be the head of a chicken than the tail of a phoenix. After he saw Doc reactivate Magical Animal Society, he felt a sense of competition. As the head of the Marine Biology Club, he would join the competition and lead the members out of the dark corners and back into the light. That was what he said. However, White didn't drag Luo Boat down with him. He still supported him in joining the sports club. Luo Boat, who successfully entered the night course and transformation course, would definitely have a bright future in the sports club. He would also start to move forward in the 2nd grade, and his speed wouldn't be slow. Dake's eyes moved slightly. Other than White and Luo Boat, AI Ma joined the literature club, and Sarah joined the archaeology club. Sarah's good friend Heidi, Dolan's good friend Pittan, and Eudora all joined the astrology club. As for Dolan himself, he joined the student council. Justin Wayne from the night course also joined the sports club with Luo Boat. The 2nd grade students all walked their own paths. Dake. Yes. Let's go. Okay. Dake picked up his bag and walked out the door. Today was Monday, and he was going to call the club's guidance professor, Lily Laplace, to officially meet the new members. However, his trip wasn't smooth. Lily's office was empty. After knocking on the door for a long time without receiving a response, Dake could only sigh and say, "It seems that I can only postpone it until tomorrow. The first class tomorrow morning is math class, so I'll just let you know then." Deanna asked, "Then we're going to the club classroom now?" Dake nodded and said, "Yes. With the club classroom, there's also another place to do homework. Don't you have a lot of questions about magic theory?" Deanna looked away. "What?" Dake smiled. Let's go. But as soon as he turned his head, a black shadow suddenly hung down from the ceiling. He subconsciously jumped back a step, raised his hand, and slapped him. But just as his palm reached the air, he quickly stopped and then fell down with a black face. It was Professor Li, who was hanging upside down in the air, making a face at him. "When did you get here?" Dake said with a dark face. "Hey." Li turned around and laughed. "I've been here since your class ended." Dake's heart skipped a beat. He asked, "Is there something you need from me?" "Yes." Li rolled his eyes and said, "Professor Bacon asked me to invite you over." "Professor Bacon?" Dake couldn't help but frown. If it was Professor Bacon, Could it be that there was a problem with the teaching materials? With this thought in mind, Dake voiced his doubts. Lily immediately nodded like a chick pecking at rice. Dake was slightly helpless. He could only say to D. Anna and Luoc, "You guys go to the club classroom first, I'll go take a look." "Okay." D. Anna and Luoc looked at each other and waved at Dake. "Yo-yos." After the two left, Dake said, "Let's go, where are we going?" "Follow me." Lily immediately grabbed Dake's hand. A stream of magic instantly gushed out from his fingertips and enveloped Dake's whole body. Then the two's bodies blurred like phantoms and flew forward. They flew through walls. Only 2 minutes later, the two rushed into a room and came to a sudden stop. Dake tried to recall the route to the castle. He was sure that they were in a classroom dormitory. He shook his head to make the dizziness go away and opened his eyes to look around. The intellectual lady sitting behind the desk should be Professor Bacon. She was still holding a pen, and there were all kinds of papers and reference materials on the desk. But Professor Bacon wasn't the only one in the room. Several professors were sitting on the sofa and chatting. There was an old professor who looked to be at least 70 or 80 years old who was still glaring at them. Even though Dake and Lily were there, he was still spitting saliva everywhere. Dake glanced at the pot of tea on the table and suddenly thought of a word: tea party. Then he glared at Lily, only to find that she had already floated over to the sofa. She grinned and said, "Coming, coming. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Each question is worth 100 credits. The more difficult questions are worth 1,000 credits. The teaching materials are authorized for 10,000 credits per year. Fair and honest, no haggling." Dake's face darkened. He completely realized that he had been tricked by little Lily again. But so what if it was a tea party? It wasn't like they wouldn't turn him down. In order to alleviate the awkwardness of standing in the center, he walked towards the desk. Professor Bacon stopped writing and looked up at Dake. She said, "Dake Dimming? Or Anonymous?" Dake paused for a moment and smiled. "Of course it's Dake Dimming." Professor Bacon was puzzled. "Then who is Anonymous?" Dark said, "A mathematician who hides his identity." "Mathematics, the study of numbers. What a good name." Professor Bacon sighed and waved at Dake. Dake naturally walked over. He walked around the desk and stood in front of Professor Bacon. Professor Bacon looked like she was in her 40s. She didn't have any foreign features. Her hair was a normal color and her eyes were dark brown. Her skin was very white because she didn't leave the house, but there were some wrinkles on her forehead. She looked a little tired and there were dark circles under her eyes. When she saw Dake walk over, she turned to face him and raised both of her hands. Dake hesitated for a moment, but he still raised his hand and placed it on her hand. In fact, Dake's age in both of his lives was younger than Professor Bacon's, let alone his mental age. It wasn't awkward to be held by an elder like this. However, Professor Bacon was considered very young among the mathematics professors in Shangmalian Academy. Li, who looked younger, was actually not younger than her. Professor Bacon held his hand and after a while, she suddenly squinted and said, "What a good kid." Dake took his hand back and asked, "Professor Bacon, Professor Li said that you encountered some problems when compiling the textbook. What are the details?" Professor Bacon was stunned for a moment. She blinked and said, "Oh, right, look here. Which cover do you think is the best for Mathematics 2? Dake. Ju. After Dake seriously helped Professor Bacon choose the cover, Professor Bacon summoned a magic elf and ordered it to send the entire textbook over to be photocopied. She then turned to Dake and said, "Oh right, the cost of the textbook this time is 50,000, right? Wait a second." She opened the drawer and took out her school card. Dake's eyes twitched. He finally remembered that he still had 50,000 credits that had not been transferred to his account. He immediately took out his school card. Professor Bacon overlapped his school card and gently swiped it. A beep sound came from Dake's school card. It was a notification that his account had been transferred to his account. With this, his credits broke through the 100,000 mark for the first time. This degree of wealth, even among the upper grades, was quite shocking. Dake looked at the number displayed on the card and suddenly felt that it was great to be tricked by Li. His mood instantly became better because of this. Therefore, when Li pulled him to meet the other professors, his face was full of smiles. There were a total of 6 arithmetic professors in St. Marian College, as well as 2 full-time arithmetic elective professors. Now, there were 6 of them. Other than Li and Professor Bacon, the other 4 were sitting on the sofa. Among them, the 70 or 80-year-old professor was named Lars Murnau. He was a professor who had just transferred from the 6th grade to the 1st grade. He was a professor who had started working at the academy during the war and had already trained 9 batches of students. This year, he had just finished teaching 1 batch and immediately took over the position of the 1st grade. However, his body could not keep up and he had been using medicine to nurse himself back to health. Principal Aerti originally wanted him to retire, but he felt that he could still teach 1 more batch. He spent the rest of his life like this. He watched the students he taught walk into various positions. Whether it was on the battlefield to fight for mankind or walking into the business world to become rich, he felt sincerely happy. He had entrusted most of his life to the education industry and wanted to welcome the end of it. This year's 1st grade students was his last batch and he hoped that it would be the most perfect batch. Hello, I'm Lars Murnau. Although I'm a bit early, can I get a year of authorization for mathematics I? Professor Murnau suddenly shut up and suddenly asked a question, which made Dake slightly surprised. However, Dake then said, "No problem. The development of mathematics needs to be passed down. Even if it's provided to the 1st grade students for free, there is no problem at all." "How can that be?" Professor Murnau immediately glared and said, "Knowledge is valuable. Let's do as Li said, 10,000 a year?" Dake smiled and nodded, No. Then, beep, another 10,000 was received. The remaining 3 professors looked at each other. One of the professors, who looked like he was in his 50s, suddenly said, "I don't need the 1st grade materials. Can you give me a year of authorization for the 2nd grade materials?" "You are?" Dake asked curiously. The professor then explained himself, Ricky Eric, 3rd grade math professor. Dake thought for a bit and said, "I have no problem with it, but the Mathematics 2 materials belong to the 2nd grade. Professor Eric smiled and said, "No problem, I'll buy it after you buy the 3rd grade materials." As he said that, he took out his campus card and transferred 10,000 academic credits to Dake. Beep! Dake's mood became better when he heard the crisp sound of the credits being transferred. He could not help but look at the remaining 2 professors. One of the professors smiled and said, "I'm a 5th grade professor. The mathematics knowledge of 5th grade professors is already set, so I won't burden the students. However, Professor Yorks wants to teach related content in the elective class." Professor Yorks was around 40 years old. He had a distinctive bald spot on his head that was very shiny. He took the opportunity and said, "I want both. Can you give me a 50% discount?" Dake looked at Professor Murnau and Professor Eric. When he saw the 2 customers nodding, he smiled and said, "Of course." Another 10,000 was received. Just like that, he only made 1 trip today and received a total of 80,000 academic credits. It could be said that wealth fell from the sky. He could even wake up smiling in his sleep. After the money was received, Dake became more patient. He sat on the sofa at the invitation of the professors and discussed mathematics with them without any barriers. Especially when it came to the problems in Mathematics I and Mathematics 2, he explained almost everything he knew without holding back. Not long after, Professor Li and Professor Bacon also joined in. Thus, this small academic tea party began. Dake also learned a lot from the exchange. Some of the problems that troubled him when he was compiling teaching materials were also solved during the exchange. In fact, in terms of knowledge, the professors were far more knowledgeable than him. However, the focus of both sides was different. When the professors encountered some insurmountable problems, they would try to use magic as a tool to bypass some procedures and directly obtain the answer. Or when faced with a complex calculation problem, They could use the most basic calculation method to quickly list out all the calculation procedures like a computer and finally obtain the answer. They were not like Dake, who used a variety of ready-made theorems to simplify the calculation. It could be said that although they used two sets of ideas, they were both heading towards the same destination. However, using magic to assist calculation was the patent of a high-level mage or magus. It was not something that ordinary students could touch. Also, due to the limitation of magic, there was a limit to the amount of calculation they could do. Therefore, Dake's calculation method was obviously more efficient and more suitable for mathematics. Yes. The professors no longer used the word arithmetic in their mouths. Instead, they kept saying mathematics, as if they were children who had just learned a trending term and could not stop using it. Once one was immersed in mathematics, one would feel that time was of no use. When the professors suddenly stopped, they realized that it was already past 8:30. Although it was not late for them, the problem was that no one here had eaten dinner. The old Professor Murnau also needed to rest. Then let's call it a night, Professor Bacon said reluctantly. Everyone else echoed his sentiments. Only Professor Murnau said firmly, "Don't worry about me, I can still do it." Then, he drank a bottle of magic potion. He looked like he could do it if no one else could. Cough, cough, cough. Professor Bacon suddenly coughed 3 times and said, "Melno, it's best not to show off when you shouldn't. Tell me your main purpose today." Professor Murnau seemed to be in pain. His brows, which were already full of wrinkles, were tightly knitted together. His head of white hair looked like it had been through a lot. He seemed to be very reluctant to admit his age, but in the end, he still turned to Dake and called, "Dake Dimming." Dake felt a little strange. He did not know what Professor Murnau's main purpose was. However, due to the virtue of respecting the old and loving the young, he said, "I'm listening, Professor." Professor Murnau's face was a little long and narrow. His eyes were small, his nose was not high, and there was a white beard on his cheeks. There was also a small strand of white beard on his chin. He did not look kind at all, but his words and actions exuded the aura of a teacher. It was easy to relax in front of him. In terms of height, he was actually quite tall. However, as he aged, his muscles atrophied and his back bent, making him look thin and small. At this moment, Professor Murnau slightly looked away. There was a rare blush on his cheeks. The other professors looked at him kindly and waited for him to say it himself. These professors, who could argue until their faces turned red, were unusually gentle at this moment. Dake sat upright and waited for Professor Murnau to speak. Finally, Professor Murnau turned his gaze back and said, "Do you have any intention of becoming my teaching assistant?" Teaching assistant, as the name suggested, was a teacher who assisted the professor in teaching. Usually, they would take on the responsibility of grading homework. Dake was very surprised by Professor Murnau's invitation. However, Professor Murnau's attitude was very serious. He maintained his calm appearance and began to think in his heart. In fact, he did not want to waste time on a teaching assistant position. He had just been promoted to the 2nd year. There were more things he wanted to do than mountains. If he became Professor Murnau's teaching assistant, not only would he have to spend extra time grading homework, but he would also be distracted. He could not be like Panduola, who was a librarian and had to take care of so many things at the same time. The room was very quiet. The professors seemed to be waiting for the 2 people to make a decision. Professor Murnau was famous for being stubborn. He needed to be more determined than the average person to make a decision like this. However, his body could not tolerate his stubbornness anymore. In order to fulfill his wish of teaching the last batch of students, he needed an assistant who could help relieve his pressure. It would be best if it was someone who could take over his classes. Professor Murnau saw Dake's concern and slowly said, "It won't take up any more of your time. Grading homework, setting exam questions, and other work related to the learning of the students will all be done by me. But I need someone to help me share one of the 2 classes every week. The time is the first class on Tuesday morning." First class on Tuesday morning? Dake frowned and roughly understood what Professor Murnau meant. Because in the 2nd year's class schedule, The first class on Tuesday morning was also mathematics class. When he realized this, he could not help but look at Professor Li. Li immediately opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. He pouted and made a whistling gesture. The first year's class schedule overlapped with the second year's class schedule on Tuesday. This was clearly planned for a long time. The professor's intentions were very clear. Since Dake was the one who wrote the textbooks, there was no need for him to waste time on mathematics. So, what if he used his time to help Professor Murnau reduce his burden? This was the best of both worlds. There was nothing he could not agree to. Dake thought it through and said, "If it's just Tuesday morning, no problem." Phew. Little Li sighed in relief. Professor Murnau was still embarrassed as he said, "Then I'll leave the first year to you. As for your assistant salary, it will be 1/5 of the professor's salary." Salary? Doc paused for a moment and asked, "How much?" Professor Murnau smiled and said, 2,000 academic credits. But you won't have any paid holidays or end-of-term bonuses. Dake said, "Of course. 1 class per week, 4 classes per month." If he were to earn 2,000 credits, that would be 500 credits per class. This was no longer something that could be explained by earning money. However, the professor's salary was less than he expected. It was likely that the end-of-semester bonuses were the biggest. Also, the professors seemed to be able to apply for research funding from the school. That was the real benefit. Of course, the exact salary did not matter. Dake was just using his time to earn some extra money. I wonder how Victoria and Phoenix will react when they see me enter the classroom? He could not help but smile. After reaching a consensus, Dake and Professor Murnau signed a contract with relaxed conditions. After the first-year mathematics class was adjusted, there were only 2 classes a week. Each class was held in a large lecture hall and was taught by all 4 departments. The main purpose of this was to reduce Professor Murnau's workload. Of course, with the addition of an assistant, the workload would be reduced. After Dake signed the contract, he discussed some of the teaching details with Professor Murnau. He was already very experienced in this area. After a few sentences, Professor Murnau realized that he had found the right person. On the other hand, Professor Lilly, who had secretly arranged this matter, had been snickering on the side. 9:30 am. Dake and Professor Murnau finished their conversation. Dake then got up and said, "I'll go back first." Professor Murnau said gently, "Remember that I will be waiting for you in the classroom at 8 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning." Dake smiled and said, "Don't worry, I'm not late." Professor Murnau shook his hand again and said, "Then I'll leave it to you." Dake shook his hand and said, "See you tomorrow, Professor." Then he turned around and prepared to leave through the front door. But Lily grabbed his hand, and with a bayou sound, she took him through the wall again and sped away. After only 2 minutes, they arrived at the cafeteria. At 9:30 p.m., there were only a few customers in the cafeteria. The halfling chefs were talking about the latest popular topics and were not surprised by Li's sudden appearance. Let's eat, it's my treat," Li said casually and pulled Dake to the window. As they got closer, Dake heard the halfling auntie at the window talking about the new shops in Traveller Street. One of them was National Duel Club, Academy Branch. Because the card production was still in the final stage, the National Duel Club mainly sold photocopies. It was very popular when it was launched 2 days ago. Unfortunately, the production of photocopies was limited and could only be provided daily. Even though the students did not understand the relationship between National Duel Club and photocopies, they all remembered this new shop. Of course, this also had a lot to do with the cute twin shop owners. When the Magical Animal Society produced special products, Dake would add a special shelf for the Magical Animal Society in the branch and put the products there for sale. This was a steady source of credits. Dake was in a good mood and did not care about Li shouting, "Treat," in the free cafeteria. "Is there anything else you're hiding from me?" After the two sat down, Dake said casually while putting food into Li's bowl. No. Lily replied without even blinking her eyes as she happily ate her favorite delicacies. Doc let out a sigh and started eating as well. Seeing how Lily earned so many credits for him, he decided to let her go this time. After dinner, the two did not stay and directly separated on the path outside the cafeteria. Dake turned around and ran towards the spiral clock tower. Fortunately, he just caught up with the club members coming down from the top of the clock tower. Not only Anna and the other three, but there were also 11 magic elves jumping behind them. The feathered serpent golem on the tower of the aristocrat house was already used to the magic elves coming in and out, so it did not stop them. "Good evening, everyone." Dake awkwardly and politely greeted the club members. "Hello, President." Katerina took the lead and the four girls said in unison. The magic guide fairies were a bit slower, and they all started meowing. The little demonic beast flew to Doc's shoulder with a crash. The rest of the magic elves also surrounded them. Anna asked, President, where did Professor Lily take you?" Dake smiled and said, "A simple academic tea party." Anna did not understand and said, Oh. Katerina and Brittany were a bit surprised. Katerina subconsciously asked, "Which subject is the academic tea party?" "Doc. Math. It's for arithmetic. 5 in 1 10,000 plus. 0181/233. Good morning, brother. The diligent baby is asking for monthly votes again." Chapter 555. An Academic Tea Party for Arithmetic Class? Katrina covered her mouth, her face full of disbelief. She might be able to join in on subjects like potioneering or history of magic. But when it came to arithmetic, one could either know it or not. How was she supposed to hold an academic tea party with knowledgeable professors? Katrina's grades weren't the best, but she was confident in her reading ability. She felt that what Dake said was unbelievable. But when she turned to look at the others, she found that Anna and Luoc didn't seem surprised at all. It seemed that Dake Diming's arithmetic class had reached that level. Katerina fell silent. Brittany Christian didn't have as clear a sense as Katrina, but she didn't think much of it either. The group returned to the castle in a strange atmosphere, then walked back to their dorms at the fork in the road. Website: https://m Vipcanchu. VIP. But after taking a few steps, Katrina suddenly stopped. She was born in Signs, which was known as the capital of knowledge. She grew up in an environment with a strong academic atmosphere. She had heard about all kinds of people who were born with knowledge, but this was the first time she saw one with her own eyes. Is this the Valkyrie's son who won the Easter Duel Festival 2 years in a row? No, maybe it's just an academic tea party in name, but it's actually a meeting for the professors to guide the students? Katrina tried her best to convince herself. But Dake noticed that her footsteps had stopped, so he turned around and asked curiously, "What's wrong, Katrina?" Katrina had no choice but to turn around and respond. She couldn't help but ask, "President, does your academic tea party have a theme?" "A theme?" Dake thought for a while and said, "Well, there is one. You can say it's mathematics." Katrina asked curiously, "Mathematics?" Dake smiled and nodded. "Yes, mathematics. If it's the 3rd grade, Professor Eric should be preparing soon. Maybe you'll start your math class next class." Katrina was even more confused. "Mathematics class?" Dake explained, "It's another name for arithmetic class. In short, he would know when the time came. Good night, senior sister. *I/Omega/. Dake waved his hand and left for real this time. Katerina also turned around and walked towards the Sorcerer's Institute, but as she walked, she suddenly turned around and walked towards the library. Even though the second class tomorrow morning was math, she still couldn't help but want to go to the library to find out what math was. On Dake's side, Luoc's curiosity was piqued. He whispered, "Is it about the textbook?" Dake nodded. "Yes. Our math textbook for this year has already been compiled, and the first math lesson should be handed out tomorrow morning. But I'm not going to math class tomorrow." Anna was humming a song as she walked forward. When she heard the message, she suddenly stopped and pricked up her ears. Eh? Dake couldn't help but laugh. That's not right. I probably won't even go to math class this year. That's why Anna has to take notes seriously in class. Otherwise, if you don't even know what you don't know, how can I explain it to you? Diana immediately pouted and said coquettishly, "Why must I not know how to do it? Can't it be that Diana has mastered everything after taking notes seriously?" Luo Si hugged Anna from the side and scratched her armpits. Anna's fantasy was shattered, and she giggled. The moonlight tonight was beautiful as usual. The moonlight shone through the windows of the castle, and the shadows of the three people were extremely long. They gradually overlapped. Anna and Luo Si were surprised when they heard that Dake was going to be a first-year teaching assistant. They originally thought that Dake just didn't have to go to class. After all, he was the editor of the teaching materials. They didn't expect that he would bring them an even bigger surprise. While they were still worried about the difficulty of the subject, Dake Dimeng had already become a professor. The first-year students should be surprised, right? The two girls went into the dormitory playfully. Dake also went into the room with the magic elves. He picked up the kitty plant that rushed up to welcome him, turned on the light, and sat by the bed for a moment. Then, he took out today's great sins. While there was still some time, he took out his mathematics eye and started to prepare for tomorrow's class. Although he had a lot of money now, the fixed monthly salary of 2,000 credits was still very considerable. If the 2,000 credits were converted into holy coins, it would be 32,000 holy coins a month. Even in the King City, it was considered a high salary. Moreover, he only had to attend 4 classes a month, and the working time was only 6 hours. Yes, 6 hours. After careful calculation, he found that he had already gained a huge advantage. What a professor needed to do was not just to teach. However, even if he didn't have this salary, he didn't mind taking on this job as an assistant. Knock, knock, knock. Just as Dake was immersed in his thoughts, there was a light knock on the dormitory door. Without needing his instructions, the little devil beast had already flown to open the door. The person who appeared at the door was indeed Aurora. Dake put down his pen and quietly closed the textbook. He was going to give Aurora a surprise tomorrow. Aurora tied her silver-white hair behind her head and put on a chef's hat. She was still wrapped in an apron that she had not taken off. Dake looked at the plate in front of her chest, took a light breath, and said, "Little Aurora, it's already very late. I don't want to affect your rest because of this." Aurora's face was slightly red. She shook her head and said, "No, it won't. I will get enough sleep every day. And today, I installed a simple kitchen and a smoking and fireproof device on the balcony. In the future, I don't need to go to the kitchen and can study recipes in the room. Look, this is the bun you told me about." As she said that, she opened the round cover on the plate. The rich smell of the meat bun, as if it was engraved in the bone marrow, slowly drifted out from the gap of the cover. Then, as the cover was completely opened, the room was suddenly filled with the smell of the meat bun. The magical spirits that had already climbed onto the small bed suddenly poked their heads out from under the blankets. Their small noses kept twitching. The little devil beast's mouth suddenly drew an arch. Little Snorlax, who was too lazy to move, decided to settle down in the club dormitory in the end, didn't know what it had missed out on. "I'm going to die from laughter. What a joke." Dake couldn't help but feel hungry. He thought that gluttony would erupt one day, but his body couldn't help but move on its own. Aurora's culinary skills were really good. She was already comparable to Olga and could be compared to the halfling chefs. What she lacked was only recipes and experience. Her skill level was far beyond that of a dabbler like Dake. For example, the meat bun tonight. Dake had only mentioned it briefly. Not only did she copy it, she even made a steamer for herself. "How much time did you spend researching the meat bun?" Dake couldn't help but ask. Aurora lowered her head slightly and whispered, "Not much. Just the weekend and 2 days. No wonder she didn't come last night." Dake took a deep breath as he looked at the meat bun. The gluttony in his heart couldn't help but crawl out. "Let me try." As he said that, he picked up the silver fork on the plate and inserted it into the meat bun. Aurora's culinary skills were amazing. The meat bun's skin was thin and didn't break. When the fork was inserted, a thick gravy flowed out from the gaps. The smell of the meat became even more intense. Dake used his other hand to cushion the bottom. He carefully forked the first bun and put it into his mouth. Then, he gently bit into it. The gravy flowed into his mouth from the torn skin. The temperature was just right, and it wasn't too hot. The gravy was slightly salty, but it was just right for Dake's taste. He couldn't help but bite off a piece of meat wrapped around the bun's skin. Then, he hurriedly chewed it carefully. The incomparably familiar and wonderful taste instantly spread out, leaving a rich aftertaste. When the entire meat bun was in his stomach, gluttony +1 slowly floated in front of Dake's eyes. When he saw the sinful index that only he could see, he couldn't help but think, why don't I just make gluttony my next research target? Aurora actually brought quite a number of meat buns, but with so many magic elves, even if they only had one each, it would still be a steamer. Thus, it didn't take long for the meat buns to be completely eaten. Aurora looked at the empty steamer, but her heart was filled with satisfaction. She felt as if she had found the meaning of being in the academy. Today's meat buns are very delicious. Dake looked at her seriously and used the most ordinary words to express his current feelings. Then I'll make more tomorrow night, Aurora said forcefully. Dake hurriedly said, Don't, you've just entered the academy. Your studies are more important. Aurora smiled faintly and said, The knowledge in those textbooks is very simple. I'll be able to understand it after taking a look. Dake blinked and could only say, But the contents in the textbooks are only the most basic. If you want to truly achieve something, you have to learn how to study deeply and do research on your own. The Shang Malian Academy's library is a place where you can find almost all of the existing books. Senior Panduola is the librarian of the library. Aurora nodded and said, I've already been to the library and greeted Senior Panduola. When I'm not studying culinary arts, I'll also read and study. Don't worry about me. Also, I successfully refined a magical fantasy beast yesterday. Do you want to take a look? Magical fantasy beast? Dake was slightly startled and asked doubtfully, Shouldn't the first-year student's first magic elf be refined at the beginning of next month? Aurora lowered her eyelids and said, The introduction to magic professor gave each of us a bag of magical fantasy beast materials after the second class. Dake, 1 bag per person? Aurora hurriedly shook her head and said, That's not it. I think it's just Anna, and Chi, John, Joey, Vivian. There are about 10 of them in total. Dake took a deep breath and said, This is preferential treatment. Aurora thought for a moment and said, That should be it. According to the professor, the few of us have a solid enough foundation and can refine magical fantasy beasts in advance. Dake asked, What about Victoria and Phoenix? Aurora shook her head and said, They haven't. That's true. Dake nodded and said, Although Victoria and Phoenix have come into contact with magic knowledge, they only officially started learning after entering the academy. Also, as magic elves, their control of magic power still needs to be trained. Can you summon your magical fantasy beast for me to see? Aurora understood what he meant and immediately took out the magic elven card from her carry-on card bag. Dake said slowly, The magical fantasy beast is your first magic elf other than your familiar. It may not be strong, but it's the embodiment of a Magus's personal characteristics and is very important to a Magus. I've already given your familiar a certain degree of intelligence. This magical fantasy beast is the second and temporarily the last. You have to understand. Aurora nodded obediently and then blushed as she used the usual summoning spell. Although the speed wasn't fast, she still successfully summoned the magical fantasy beast in her hand. The fantasy beast that appeared above the summoning array was a round mirror that floated in the air. This kind of magic guide fairy was actually quite rare. Dake was a little surprised and couldn't help but observe it carefully. Aurora's round mirror had 2 sides. The front side was like the sun emitting blazing flames, and the back side was like the full moon emitting cold moonlight. Different frames and different attributes caused the 2 mirrors to be completely different. The front side was a mirror made of copper, and the backside was a silver-white mercury mirror. From the feeling, it didn't have the dual attributes of fire and ice on the surface, but the even rarer dual attributes of light and darkness. Dake suppressed the urge to ask about its attributes and sure kill skills and sighed, "Your magical fantasy beast is quite strange." Aurora reached out and grabbed the handle of the mirror, blushing as she said, "My magical fantasy beast is called the glorious sun-moon mirror. The front side can absorb sunlight, and the back side can absorb moonlight. But for some reason, it doesn't have a sure kill skill. It's just a white card." "Just a white card?" Dake frowned slightly and said, "Maybe it's just that you haven't found the right way to use it. I'll help you activate your intelligence first." Aurora said excitedly, "Okay." Dake took out Pride Eye again and activated it, shining it at the glorious sun-moon mirror. Even if a magic elf was to activate its intelligence, its thinking would be less active than the average person. Just like Dake's scabbard, it could float in the air without thinking. But as for the specifics, Aurora had to develop it herself. After the glorious sun-moon mirror's intelligence was activated, it didn't show much. But when Aurora whispered to it, it had an exact response. Dake looked at the mirror and suddenly had an idea. He immediately wrote a line of words and showed it, saying, "Little Aurora, look at the mirror and read this." Aurora was puzzled, but she still read it word by word. Magic mirror, who is the most beautiful woman in the world?" After saying this sentence, Aurora's cheeks instantly flushed red like fire. Dark immediately looked at the surface of the brilliant sun-moon mirror, but the magical fairy didn't give him any face at all. There was no movement on either side of the mirror at all. "KSK." He clicked his tongue. The experiment was a failure. "That's not right, at least I got a red apple." When Aurora took the cutlery and left, she suddenly felt like she was being teased. But she quickly convinced herself. Dake isn't that kind of person. However, the speed at which she moved her feet increased. Dake returned to his desk and sat down. He spun his pen and thought for a moment, but he couldn't think of how to use the mirror with a very interesting name. He had no choice but to temporarily put this problem aside and continue to prepare for class. When he was ready, it was already past midnight. The fragrance of the healing flower became very faint after it drifted away, and it was basically impossible to smell. But its effect continued to be exerted, and there was a faint sense of comfort when bathed in the fragrance of the flower. In order to be energetic when he woke up early in the morning, Dake practiced the underworld spirit spell for 15 minutes before he went to sleep. At 6 o'clock sharp on Tuesday morning, Dake Dimeng was awakened by his biological clock. He continued to sleep for a while and got up before sloth +1. Then, he began to take care of his hair and appearance. Since it was his first time substituting for the first year, he had to leave a good impression on the first-year students. Even if the identities of Victoria and Phoenix were exposed later, as long as his image was high enough, it would make it easier for the first-year students to accept their identities. These were the additional effects that a good impression could bring. After spending half an hour carefully taking care of himself, Dake looked at himself in the mirror without any flaws. He nodded slightly and walked out of the bathroom. Then, he elegantly finished the breakfast brought by the little monster, wiped the corners of his mouth, and read the newspaper as usual. A week after school started, the reports about the Shang Malian Academy in the newspaper had decreased to almost nothing, but the Holy Judgment operation of the saint was exposed. Whether it was the Great Sage Daily or the Clown Daily, they published the news of the Holy Judgment operation on a large scale. Although the ultimate goal of the Holy Judgment operation was difficult to achieve, it had to be said that its effect was gradually showing. Evil organizations and remnants of the demon clan were continuously captured or killed on the spot. The news of some notorious criminals being punished by the Holy Church was also widely publicized in the newspapers. The prestige of the saint increased after the immortal demon king was executed, and during the Holy Judgment operation, it further increased. It was not known if it was because of the benefits, but the saint showed obvious signs of self-promotion. Dake didn't care much about the situation of the saint. He just habitually glanced at it, and then, there was no then. After he finished reading the newspaper, he once again reviewed the content that he was going to talk about in class, and then put the things that he needed into his shoulder bag. Finally, He thought about it and stuffed a magic pen into it. Professors usually held a magic wand when they were teaching. It could be used to assist in casting spells, and it could also be used as a substitute for a pointer. Dake didn't have such a thing, so he simply used a magic pen as a substitute. At 7:30, everything was ready. He tightened his collar and pushed the door open. After he left, the magic elves in the dormitory got up and took care of themselves. Then they would wait until the 8 o'clock bell rang before going to the cafeteria to eat. After that, most of them would go to the club classroom, and a few of them would go to the library. In short, wherever the fragrance of the flowers reached, it was their range of activity. The students and professors in the castle would occasionally see these magic elves and would give them a curious look. Fortunately, they were cute and well-behaved, so it was hard to leave a bad impression. If this continued for a long time, most people would passively get used to their existence. It was just that the first-year students who had just started learning magic theory would have a hard time understanding how these magic elves could be so smart. Dake walked out of the tower, and under the confused gazes of the second-year students, he gradually walked away from them. It should be here. Dake lowered his head and looked at the map displayed on his school card. After confirming that he was not in the wrong place, he couldn't help but quicken his pace. Not long after, there were some small voices in front of him. The first-year mathematics classroom was in front of him. Found it. Dake instantly slowed down his pace and calmed himself down. He had more than one experience as a substitute teacher, so he wouldn't be flustered by this kind of thing. But after all, this was his first time working as a first-year student. In addition to teaching, he also needed to remember the names of all the students during the roll call. In this aspect, no matter which professor it was, they all seemed to do a good job. But he didn't have much confidence. But rats had their ways, and snakes had their ways. He also had his own methods. In front of the classroom, Dake lightly raised his left hand, and a thick black grimoire appeared in his palm. Then, he raised his head and puffed out his chest, and pushed open the classroom door. The lecture hall that could accommodate all the first-year students was very spacious. Just as Dake was familiar with, the entire classroom was divided into 4 areas according to the school. Each school's students sat in their own area. The first-year mathematics professor, Lars Murnau, was sitting in the corner of the podium near the window, and he didn't hide his observation of the students below the podium. And the students, under the gaze of the old professor, only dared to whisper, quietly guessing Professor Murnau's intentions. Not far from Professor Murnau, 2 little princesses were sitting in the first row of the noble house area, and they were having a heated discussion. Anna and Enchi had an argument over seats on the first day of school. Neither of them wanted to sit with each other, but they both wanted to sit in the first row. In the end, they squeezed in the first row and stared at each other, and the seats in the back were all taken. When they came back to their senses, the seats were already nailed down, and they could only grit their teeth and sit down. After leaving the eyes of the first princess and the second princess, Anna and Enchi became more and more unscrupulous. Even the professors had a headache because of them. And in the second row behind them sat Joey and Aurora. These 2 could be said to be the second in line of the first-year noble house. While the 2 little princesses were staring at each other, Aurora was reading Mathematics I very seriously. Joey, who was next to her, was also affected and was flipping through the book. Next to the noble house was the night house. Phoenix's seat was relatively at the back. She was taller among the first years, so she chose to sit in the back row. At this moment, she tilted her head slightly and looked out of the window. No one knew what she was thinking. And in the last row of the night house area sat the tallest student among the first years, Spike Leon. This orc royal sat alone at the back, reading a book with his bell-sized eyes. On the other side, John Dimming of the magic school sat in the middle, carefully flipping through the textbook. As for the dark elf Vivian Alvind, she sat in the front row without minding the stares of others. She was very serious even though she was alone. Only Victoria Dimming of the House of Fools was absent-minded from the beginning. The books on the table were neatly placed, and it was obvious that they had not been touched since they were taken out. It was not until Dake kept approaching that she showed a puzzled expression. Creak! The classroom door was suddenly pushed open, and a handsome blonde youth walked into the classroom with a grimoire in his hand and a sling bag on his shoulder. The atmosphere in the classroom froze for a moment, and the discussion that had been deliberately suppressed came to an abrupt end. Dark swept his gaze around and quickly found the few people he knew below the stage. He walked to the podium without a change in expression, and his gaze fell on Professor Murnau's face. This was his first class as an assistant, and Professor Murnau would sit in on the entire class. On one hand, it was to observe Dake's teaching standards, and on the other hand, it was to support Dake. This was because there were a few troublemakers among the first years this year, and even he felt a headache coming on. Dake gestured slightly to Professor Murnau and walked to the podium. He took off his sling bag and placed it on the table, then took out his textbook, roll book, magic pen, and looked up at the audience. During this process, the first-year magisters went from confusion to shock. Their originally suppressed voices involuntarily increased in volume. Quite a few gazes were focused on Professor Murnau, who was sitting there calm and unruffled. Victoria's little mouth formed an O shape. She didn't even react when her desk mate kept poking her arm. She probably didn't expect that her master would suddenly walk in like a professor. Chown, who was immersed in his book, didn't notice anything at first. It wasn't until the atmosphere around him was obviously not right that he raised his head. Then, his handsome face suddenly turned pale, and the pen in his hand fell on the table with a clatter. Joey was even worse than Chown, and he immediately hugged his head and wanted to run away. Aurora, who was seriously reading her book, quickly came to her senses after the initial shock. Then, she saw the little princess in the front row asking Professor Murnau a question. However, Professor Murnau only had a calm look on his face as he smiled and gently stroked his white beard. Clap, clap, clap. Dake Dimming skillfully clapped his hands to attract the attention of the students, causing the noisy classroom to gradually quiet down. The students all looked up at him, waiting for him to introduce himself and explain the reason. Just then, Dake spoke with assurance. "Good morning, everyone. I'm sure most of you have seen me at the entrance banquet. Some of you will have a deeper impression of me, but some of you might not remember me very well. So, I'll introduce myself again. I'm Dake Dimming, and I've just become Professor Murnau's teaching assistant. From now on, I'll be the substitute for the first math class every week. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand and ask." As soon as he finished speaking, a girl from the magic department raised her hand. Dake raised his magic pen and pointed at her. The girl stood up and said, "Excuse me, aren't you a second-year senior? Why did you become Professor Murnau's teaching assistant? Or rather, why?" The last sentence, "why," completely highlighted the girl's aura. Her eyes were cold, her lips were thin, and her tone of voice was unconsciously raised. From the reactions of the students around her, she seemed to have a strong sense of community. In the magic department, where knowledge was paramount, she was definitely an outstanding student. Dake smiled and said, "That's a problem. Look at the last page of Mathematics I in your hand, it will tell you the answer." Cecilia Doyle looked at the last page of Mathematics I with a puzzled expression. Then, she looked from the top of the page until she saw the name, Dake Dimming. Her expression tensed up and she suddenly looked up. Dake smiled at her and asked, "Do you have any more questions?" "No." Cecilia took a deep breath and sat down. The students in the classroom flipped open their textbooks at the same time. A strange atmosphere spread out like ripples in water. The sound of the students instantly made it clear that they were not calm. Someone even raised his hand and said, "Senior Dimming, is the name written on the book really yours?" Dake turned around and wrote his name on the textbook and said, "Write it down. We will be together for at least a semester. I believe you will need to remember my name. Then, if there are no other questions, let's start the roll call." No matter how stubborn they were, they would not be able to stand up at this time, not to mention that the most stubborn first-year students were very familiar with Dake. The two little princesses puffed up their cheeks like pufferfish. For the first time since school started, they gathered together to discuss. Chown and Joey were frightened by the fear that was rooted deep in their hearts. The shadows of their childhood kept appearing one after another. Victoria and Phoenix did not know what was going on, but of course, they did not dare to say anything. At this time, no matter what, the most important thing was to pretend to be obedient. Aurora, on the other hand, was in high spirits. She enjoyed the surprise brought by Dake very much. The dark elf girl looked around and the royal orc frowned deeply. Anyway, the roll call began. The name was compared to the students' appearance one by one. The sorcerer's secretary recorded all of this. Dake did not need to deliberately memorize the name as it could show the name. After the roll call ended, Dake officially started the class. Because it was a formal class and not a substitute class like before, Dake directly asked the first-year students to open their textbooks and continue the class based on what they learned last week. The beginning of Mathematics I was all about basic calculations. It was nothing more than teaching how to use the vertical form and reciting the multiplication table. In addition, it was about the priority of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division and so on. The class itself was not difficult. After all, it was only the third class of the semester. After that, it would gradually become more difficult. Dake Dim-ing had a lot of teaching experience. Even Anna could master it under his guidance, not to mention the first-year students. He skillfully added some mathematics stories in the class, which gradually livened up the originally silent atmosphere. After a part of the content was finished, Dake quickly wrote a few questions on the blackboard. Then, he directly called out a few people who were absent-minded in class and moved on to the practice section. Chown. Chown suddenly trembled. He subconsciously stood up and tensed his body. It was the first time the students around him had seen the smart and steady Chown like this. If it was not for Professor Dim-ing standing on the podium, they would have thought that Chown had seen a ghost. Put down your books and come up to answer the questions, Dake said casually and called out Joey's name. After the younger twin was reminded by Aurora, she walked up to the podium like a zombie. Her hair bundles that were shaped like the spiral clock tower's stairs bounced up and down. It was very textured. The daughter of the Dim-ing family, who was usually noble and elegant, had completely lost her composure. People who did not know better would have thought that Professor Dim-ing on the podium did something to her. After the siblings were called out, Dake called out 2 more boys. Then, Victoria was lucky enough to call out her name. Next, he called out the Orc King Spike Leon. A total of 6 people were called up to the podium. They picked up chalk and started to calculate the equations on the blackboard. With Chown's ability, he should not have been troubled by this level of calculation. However, he could not stop shaking when he was beside Dake. He could not calm down at all. Joey, on the other hand, did not listen the whole time. His mind was a mess. On the other hand, Victoria bit her lip and crookedly listed out many vertical equations on the blackboard. Finally, she got the answer. As for the remaining 3 boys, other than the little orc, they all successfully solved the problem and hurriedly left the podium. Professor Murnau did not call out the students to come up to the podium to solve last week's class. However, they had only attended 2 classes, so they did not know if there was such a practice. However, they did not know that from this moment onwards, Professor Murnau had truly learned this trick. He had always relied on the completion of homework to assess the students' mastery of the content in the class. However, the interval between 2 classes was too long. The plagiarism of homework after class could not be stopped no matter how hard he tried. In fact, it was very difficult to grasp. Dake's method of asking a few students to come up to the podium to solve the questions every time he finished a small part of the lecture. The rest of the students solved the questions below the podium. Not only did this allow the students to consolidate the content they had just learned, but it also allowed them to grasp the difficulty of the lecture. At the same time, he also punished the bad students who were absent in class. Bad student, Chown. Bad student, Joey. Bad student, Spicer. He stood on the podium as if he was being publicly executed. If Professor Hulda Boyd, who specialized in magical languages, was here, he would definitely stop his bad habit of hanging people in the air. After all, hanging in the air was not necessarily as torturous as it was now. Professor Hulda Boyd might even praise Dake Dim-ing's teaching methods and sympathize with him. Looking at the completely frozen Chown, Joey, and Spicer, Dake frowned slightly and said, "Chown, Joey, deduct 5 points each. Spicer, if you really don't understand, you can ask the students who understand after class. You can also go to the office and ask Professor Murnau. Of course, you can also come to me. As long as you ask and learn, there's no knowledge that can't be grasped. Yes, Professor, Spicer said in a rough voice and then left the podium with a depressed expression. Joey couldn't help but mutter, "Why is he the only one who didn't get his points deducted?" Dake's gaze turned and fell on her. She couldn't help but tremble. Dake said in a kind tone, "For a mathematics class, you must have a solid foundation at the beginning. If you don't have a solid foundation, it will be very difficult to learn in the future. You guys can leave now. Be more serious in class." Joey didn't dare to refute and quickly left the podium. One of the 3 giants of the first grade in the Noble House lost all face. Chown also left the podium with a gloomy face. He felt that he could solve the questions, it was just that he wasn't in the right state. After they left, Dake explained each question and gave extra points to those who answered it correctly. No points were deducted for those who answered wrongly. The real gain of credits made some students who just understood the value of credits restless. The enthusiasm of the students was also aroused because of this. Dake took the opportunity to ask more questions in class for answers. The students who wanted to earn credits immediately answered the questions enthusiastically. The atmosphere of the class quickly became better. Ring, ring, ring. Unknowingly, the bell had already rung. Dake put down his pen reluctantly and then gave out the related homework. Today's class was quite enjoyable. See you guys next week. He realized that he seemed to have a good teacher side of himself. When Dake was about to leave the classroom, Professor Murnau waved at him and he slowed down. When Professor Murnau caught up, the two walked side by side. Professor Murnau wasn't stingy with his praises for his teaching standards. He was embarrassed. "It's not that good. I just learned from the professor." "Which professor?" Li. Ha ha ha, this joke isn't cold enough." The old man and the young man exchanged their teaching experiences for a while and then separated at the fork in the road. Dake still had classes to teach and Professor Murnau should go back to rest. After the two professors left, the first grade classroom suddenly exploded with noise. Not all the students agreed with Dake's teaching. The pride in their bones made them instinctively reject a young professor who was only a year older than them. Immaturity would make people rash and impulsive. And John and Joey's poor performance in class would also attract criticism. Conflict and bigotry often arose under these circumstances. The two little princesses fanned the flames and accelerated the ferment of the matter. With the princesses as backers, the discussion on how to deal with the new professor quietly unfolded in the dark. Victoria was among them and blinked her eyes. She didn't understand why these people would belittle the magisters in front of the magic elves. The two little princesses looked around and snickered in their hearts. 5 in 1 10,000 plus. 0184/233. Although it's late, it's successful on the second day of August. Asking for votes. Monthly votes reached 2,000. Continue to reach 10,000 votes today. Underscore. Chapter 556. After parting ways with Professor Melner, Dake immediately turned to the history of magic classroom, completing the perfect transition from professor to student. Today's class was only average in his opinion, but as his first official class, he had to make do. Through this class, he had a general understanding of Victoria and Phoenix's class status, as well as Aurora, John, and Joey. In addition, Dark Elf Vivian was also on his radar. These 6 people were basically the ones he was more concerned about in the first years. As for the two little princesses, he really didn't need to worry about them. But this year's lineup of first-grade students is really ridiculous. The Academy of Nobles, the Academy of Knights, the Academy of Magic, and even the House of Fools have exceptionally outstanding people. I hope it's not a bad omen. About 10 minutes before class started, Dake quietly entered the History of Magic classroom through the back door. But White and Luo Boat, who were sitting in the last row by the door, still noticed him. Remember the URL. Vipkanchu. VIP Luo Boat's eyes lit up, and he immediately asked curiously, "Dake, why didn't I see you last class?" Dake tilted his head and smiled. "I went to math class." Luo Boat subconsciously asked, "Wasn't it math class last time?" Dake said, "It was first grade math class." Luo Boat mumbled, "Oh, first grade, wait, why are you in first grade class?" But Dake had already walked to the seat by the window and sat down. He took out the History of Magic textbook, flipped to the page with the bookmark, and began to read it more casually. Starting from second grade, the History of Magic finally had a new textbook. It was said that Professor Ryan Hux had specially found someone to compile the new textbook. He had put in a lot of effort to do this job well. And with the new textbook, Professor Ryan Hux no longer randomly told stories. He began to teach the history of magic systematically, and the quality of his teaching skyrocketed. Of course, the new textbook, 50,000 Years Above and Below, was indeed very well compiled. Many of the stories in it were very lively and interesting, and people couldn't help but wonder who compiled this textbook. Unfortunately, there were no names on the teaching materials, which was a pity. "He's probably a hero from the Hero Palace." While Dake was thinking about this, Deanna tried to lean her head back and asked, Dake, is your class going well?" "It's all right," Dake said with a smile. "With Professor Melno holding the fort this time, those little rascals won't dare to cause trouble." "That's good." Deanna retracted her head. Dake asked, "What do you think? Did you take notes in the last class?" Deanna hurriedly said, "Of course there is. Don't keep asking. I'm not a first-grade kid." Dake laughed. "Of course, you're a second-year student." Deanna, "That's right, I'm already in second grade." Phew. Luo C couldn't help but laugh. Not long after, Professor Ryan Hux entered the classroom. Not only did he have long flowing hair, but he was also wearing a suit and leather shoes. He looked very energetic. He lost a leg, an arm, and an eye in the war. With the help of Professor Ka Zayer, he had replaced them with the latest prosthetics. Basically, no one could tell that he was different from a normal person. If he were to stand next to him when he first came to the Shang Malian Academy, no one would be able to tell that they were the same person. In today's class, we'll talk about the beginning of the history of magic. As soon as the bell rang, Professor Ryan Hux started the class with great energy. The history of magic starts from the moment human beings learned about magic, and continues to this day. As Professor Ryan Hux spoke, the students felt as if they had traveled back in time to a few eras ago. They were strolling along the corridor of history, listening to the tide rolling forward. He was always able to create an extraordinary sense of immersion, making the students feel as if they were there. Dake also learned a lot from the history of magic class. Tuesday afternoon was the time for magical beasts. As usual, Professor Nini squeezed through the narrow classroom door. She no longer applied low-quality perfume on her body, and she was able to communicate with the students more freely. After becoming an official professor, Nini was obviously more confident, and also more confident in the choice of magical beasts for teaching. The students looked at the ferocious and terrifying magical beasts on the podium, and their faces were a mixture of fear and excitement. After all, they were children born in peacetime, and they had never faced real danger. Even if they had great power because of magical beasts, they might not be able to unleash it. Besides teaching the students about the ecology, characteristics, and value of magical beasts and magical beasts, Professor Nini's most notable feature was that she could help the students overcome their fear of these dangerous creatures. This was the main reason why she was able to pass Professor Shi Erfu's review and become an official professor. After receiving Professor Shi Erfu's approval, she had to work harder and catch more terrifying and dangerous magical beasts for the students to have an early experience. After the students familiarized themselves with Professor Nini's teaching style, they were no longer as helpless as they were at the beginning. Instead, they looked forward to magical beasts and adventures in the dungeon. It was a pity that they had to pass the physical assessment before they were allowed to enter the dungeon. After the magical beasts class ended, Dake went to the library and greeted Senior Pan Duola. Then, he went to the club's classroom and finished his homework with the club members. Katrina and Brittany finally understood what Mathematics 2 was. They looked at Dake with resentment in their eyes. Then, they realized that the Year 3 and Year 2 students were doing the same mathematics homework. Of course, the problems they encountered were quite similar. After Dake finished his homework, he took the opportunity to tutor them. Katrina's ability to digest and absorb knowledge was the best, while Brittany and Deanna were much clumsier. Especially Brittany, she lacked the patience to study quietly. Dake could only hope that the strong learning atmosphere in the club would motivate her. After the homework was done, it was time for club activities. There were basically no club activities in the Magical Beasts Club. While they were gradually adding more decorations to the club's classroom, they were all happily doing their own things. Luo and Katrina would occasionally exchange their reading experience. Deanna clumsily learned Brittany's knitting skills. Dake himself was holding the unobtainable bird egg and chanting scriptures. Since the magical beasts would gather in the club every morning, they naturally wouldn't leave the unobtainable bird egg in the dormitory. Dake held the unobtainable bird egg and tried to sense the movement inside with his mana. Recently, he felt that the egg was about to hatch. The movement inside the egg was like a baby kicking its mother's belly after 10 months of pregnancy. It made him feel very close to it. The unobtainable bird egg absorbed human aura to hatch. After hatching, its appearance, characteristics, and personality would more or less be affected by the human aura. If the human aura it absorbed was pure enough, it would recognize the human as its parent after it was born. Basically, it was a type of mystical animal. Therefore, after Dake obtained the unobtainable bird egg, he didn't let anyone other than Professor Lily come into contact with it. He was very much looking forward to the unobtainable bird egg hatching. It would give him a feeling very similar to refining a magical beasts, but a little different. Today, he had a very strong feeling that the unobtainable bird egg was about to hatch. The closer it got to night, the stronger this feeling became. It was to the point that the book in his hand didn't smell good anymore. He nestled in the club president's office, holding the unobtainable bird egg, and waiting impatiently. However, until 9 p.m., the club members all noticed that something was wrong with the club president. When they peeked at the door, the unobtainable bird egg still showed no signs of hatching. Ka-keek! Dake was a little startled when a head suddenly popped out from the ceiling. He looked up with a dark expression at Li, who had an evil smile on his face, and complained, "Can't I just enter from the front door? Wouldn't that be very uncharacteristic of a little fairy?" After Li popped out from the ceiling, she flipped in the air 3.5 times before lying on top of the unobtainable bird egg. As the club instructor of the Magical Animals Club, it wasn't surprising for her to appear in the club's classroom at any time. However, this time around, it was Doc who summoned her with his society card. Since the unobtainable bird egg was about to hatch, Lily Laplace obviously could not be present. She put her ear to the eggshell and listened carefully, then said excitedly, "It's really coming out." "Really?" "I think so too," Dake thought for a bit, then took out a children's book from the bookshelf behind him, wondering if he should read it. "What are you doing?" Lily asked curiously. Dake said, "Prenatal education, Li." Therefore, before the unobtainable bird egg hatched, Dake told it a story about a tadpole looking for its mother, so that it could instill the concept of children should not lose their parents in it, trying to change its bad habit of secretly raising other chicks before it was born. However, just as he was halfway through, the unobtainable bird egg suddenly shook. Dake immediately stopped and looked at the egg with all his attention. "Come." Lily's expression instantly became serious. She reached out and grabbed Dake's hands, then guided them to the egg. Both of their hands were tightly pressed against the sides of the eggshell, carefully feeling the movements of the chicks. Once. Twice. It moved more and more frequently. Bang! The egg suddenly jumped, and extremely thin cracks appeared on the top of the eggshell. Then, the cracks suddenly shattered like a dense spider web. A small round head broke through the eggshell and suddenly popped out. It didn't look like a normal newborn chick that couldn't even open its eyes. Its big round eyes were full of intelligence. It first glanced at Dake, then turned to look at Li, then turned to look at Dake, then turned to look at Li. It seemed to be a little dizzy, and with a squish, it sat back down in the eggshell. Chirp, why do I feel like this girl isn't very smart? Dake couldn't help but reach out and carefully poke the unobtainable bird's head. Perhaps because it was the product of the projection, this unobtainable bird was slightly different from what was recorded. Not only did it grow feathers as soon as it was born, but it also didn't have a neck. It looked like two balls stacked on top of each other, so round that it made people want to rub its feathers bald. However, considering that it was a newborn, Dake didn't do it. Bang! The door to the office was suddenly broken open, and the members of the club and the magic elves that were squeezed together fell to the ground with a crash. Then, they stood up as if nothing had happened and pretended to be surprised. Wow, the egg hatched. It was so fake that it made people's hearts ache. Ho-ho, the unobtainable beast crawled out of the crowd and ran to the desk in 3 steps. It stood on its tiptoes and clung to the edge of the desk with its claws. It stared at the unobtainable bird baby with a hint of excitement in its heart. Ever since it was summoned, the unobtainable beast didn't have a strong sense of existence. It spent most of its time in the club's classroom, and only occasionally went to the cafeteria with the magic elves to eat. However, after leaving the club's classroom, it would feel uneasy. It was as if once it left, the club's classroom would become an empty room that could be broken in and stolen at any time. The responsibility of guarding the club's classroom was like an engraving, deeply imprinted in the depths of its heart from the moment it was born. This was actually a basic circuit that was rooted in the body of the club's spirit. Now that the club's first magical animal had successfully hatched, it was like having a family member that shared the same bloodline. The feeling was naturally different. It carefully observed the black and white ball in the eggshell, and all kinds of images of its interactions with it had already appeared in its mind. After the dizzy, unobtainable bird regained consciousness, it happened to meet the unobtainable beast's gaze. It seemed to find the unobtainable beast's appearance very interesting, so it raised its wings and chirped at the unobtainable beast. When Dake saw this, he reached out and picked up the unobtainable beast from the side of the table, then placed it on the table. The unobtainable beast carefully moved forward, squatted down, stretched out its claws, and touched the unobtainable bird's fingertips. After a gentle touch, the unobtainable bird suddenly raised its head and laughed. Then, with a smack sound, it slid back and lay down along the curve of the eggshell, blinking its big eyes at the ceiling. When Dake saw that the unobtainable beast wanted to touch it, but didn't dare to, he gently patted its head and said, "Unobtainable beast, you will take care of it from now on, okay?" The unobtainable beast was stunned for a moment, then nodded vigorously, its eyes shining. Regardless of whether it was a human or a beast, only after finding the meaning of moving forward could their spirit be raised. The hatching of the unobtainable bird was the biggest surprise of the night for the Magical Zoology Club. All the magic guide fairies gathered and looked at this real baby with eager eyes. The club members hurriedly took out the child care products that they had bought in advance, scrubbed, and fed the unobtainable bird. There were also people who adjusted the size of the unobtainable bird's sleeping basket, and placed a soft and clean quilt inside. The unobtainable bird was actually a very strong species. It didn't need the protection of a female bird to survive in the cruel world of nature. In just a few days, it could grow to have teeth and claws, and its diet included tree bark, grass roots, insects, and most of the foods that were easy to obtain. Within a week, its wings would be fully developed, and it could learn to fly with a gust of wind. Thus, even if the female bird abandoned it after giving birth, it could still maintain a certain degree of survival. However, this still caused the population of the unobtainable bird to continuously decrease. In the end, it was completely dependent on the artificial breeding of mages that prevented it from going extinct. In terms of ecological inheritance, this was actually a species that was seeking death. However, this was a magical animal. It didn't make sense, but it was also a part of magical. Half an hour later, the energetic unobtainable bird fell asleep after eating and drinking to its heart's content. The unobtainable beast guarded the cradle and looked at the chubby little fellow, its heart softening. Dake originally wanted to personally take care of the unobtainable bird, but after seeing this scene, he gave up on the idea. It seemed to be a better idea to let the unobtainable bird be taken care of by the unobtainable beast. He left the room and instructed the most reliable magic guide fairies in the club dormitory, the lion, to take care of the unobtainable bird and the unobtainable beast. Then, the horned eagle man suddenly raised its head and puffed out its chest, indicating that it was fine to leave everything to it. How reliable! Dake praised. It seemed that the horned eagle man was also very fond of the unobtainable bird. This made him even more relieved. In the blink of an eye, it's already 10 o'clock. Dake patted Anna and Luo-si, who were still reluctantly looking inside, and reminded them that it was time to go back. Then, the group of people dispersed. After returning to the dormitory, Dake began to concentrate on preparing the second spell cage. The clubs in the academy were actually not peaceful because of the strong competition. The student council would rank the clubs according to the strength of the clubs. This was a completely different evaluation system from the semester review. It relied on the overall strength of the clubs. The higher the ranking of the clubs, the more club funds they would receive every month. Moreover, the top 3 societies would be able to obtain additional rare resources. However, new small clubs would generally not participate in the fierce competition. Although the club funds they received every month were very little, it was better than nothing. The clubs with high ranking would generally not lower themselves to challenge the clubs with low ranking. Not only would that make the club lose face, but they would also have to pay a huge price if they accidentally lost. There were not many idiots like that. As for the clubs with low ranking to challenge the clubs with high ranking, they first had to have a spell cage. Of course, Dake Dimeng did not take this into consideration when making the spell cage. The first class on Wednesday morning was Magic Language. Professor Holder Bode entered the classroom 3 minutes early this time. When he appeared, the classroom was instantly silent. The effect was better than Professor Shi Erfu's silence. He first put away last week's homework and then said, "From this week onwards, my homework must be completed by Friday night. It will be collected by the second-year leaders of each school and sent to my office by 6 o'clock sharp. For leaders, please stand up." The 4 class leaders who were called stood up under the pressure. It was also at this time that the students had a comprehensive understanding of the second-year leaders. The leader of the House of Nobles was Dolan Teddy. The leader of the House of Knights was Justin Wayne. The leader of the House of Magic was Heidi Euphemia. The leader of the House of Fools was Vanessa Bolt. When the 4 leaders stood up one after another, most of the students' eyes involuntarily focused on the leader of the House of Fools. The students of the House of Fools had never been particularly outstanding. Very few of them could leave a deep impression on others. The same was true for Vanessa Bolt. Her appearance was very ordinary. Her hair color was brown, and the color of her eyes was the same as her hair color. Her facial features were not particularly exquisite, and could only be described as soft and pleasant to look at. Her skin was somewhat sallow, and her figure was neither tall nor short. She was of average height for her age. Her final results last semester were slightly above average. Last week, she passed the Dual Club's recruitment test without a hitch. The students of the House of Nobles, the House of Knights, and the House of Magic probably did not expect such an ordinary person to become a leader. However, the students of the House of Fools did not seem to be against her. Dake looked at Vanessa with some curiosity. He memorized the leader of the House of Fools and then looked away. It was not polite to keep staring at people. In short, to be chosen as a leader by the student council, there had to be something extraordinary about her. This Miss Vanessa Bolt might become a formidable opponent of the House of Nobles in another 2 years. After letting the students familiarize themselves with the leaders of their respective houses, Professor Bode continued his lecture. The atmosphere of the Magic Guide class became serious. There were no more unnecessary sounds in the classroom. During the second duel class, Professor Pawacheong-si led the second-year students to Duel Hall 1 for physical training. She also checked the results of the students' training over the past week. Students who improved were praised, and those who did not were mostly criticized. Professor Pawacheong-si gradually became more strict. Her strictness also made the students more vigilant about the dangers of the dungeon. Many people thought that they would be safe with the dungeon escape device, but that was not the case. Even the professors did not fully understand the mysteries of the dungeon. The deeper they went, the more so it was. The monsters in the upper levels of the dungeon respawned once a week. Even the terrain changed accordingly. But at the middle and lower levels, the respawn rate would gradually decrease, and even lose its rhythm. Moreover, although it was called the middle and lower levels, in fact, this so-called middle and lower levels was only the middle and lower levels in the Academy's knowledge. Because the Shang Malian Academy's dungeon did not have a bottom. People in the past once crowned it with the name Limitless. At the end of the duel class, Professor Pawa Cheong-si released this week's homework. The students who successfully passed the Duel Club's recruitment test last Friday had to apply for a cultivation battle at the Duel Club this Friday. That was the newcomer competition on Saturday morning. At the end of the competition, the participating students were required to write a small paper on the analysis of the competition. Students who had already debuted, or students who did not have the qualifications to participate, also had to watch the competition. They had to choose one or more contestants to write an analysis paper with them as the core of the duel situation. This homework, which was released at the beginning of the school year, would continue for 3 weeks with the Duel Club's 3 weeks of recruitment. If they could not pass the Duel Club's recruitment test in these 3 weeks, then they could only wait for the beginning of the next semester to compete with the first-year students on the same stage. To any second-year student, this was an unbearable humiliation. But every year, there were people who fell behind. Dake was worried last semester that Luo Si would not pass. Now that he thought about it, he was overthinking it. This Saturday's cultivation battle was very likely to be Luo Si's solo show. After the duel class ended, Dake finished his lunch and went straight to the library. He happened to catch Pan Duola, who had just come for her shift. With the growth of his knowledge, there were more problems in the process of studying Curse Cage that he did not have before. Dake's first Curse Cage was created under the guidance of Pan Duola. This time, he encountered a difficult problem, so he naturally went to find Pan Duola. So without this reason, you wouldn't have come to find me? Pan Duola rested her chin on her hand and raised her eyebrows. What? Don't I greet you every time I come to the library? Dake looked away and felt a little guilty. That counts. Pan Duola put down the registration form in her hand, opened the side door of the counter, and welcomed him in. She asked curiously, "Are you preparing for the club challenge?" Dake smiled and said vaguely, "No, it's just that the club familiar that I summoned this time has similar characteristics to the little fiends." Pan Duola immediately understood and said enviously, "In this year's school championship competition, if our magic faculty wants to win, I'm afraid we have to get past you." Dake shook his head and said modestly, "The main events of the school championship competition are the dungeon tournament and the duel tournament. If we want to increase the score in the duel tournament, we have to complete the year-skipping challenge. But the 4th and 5th years of the magic faculty have you and Senior Winnie, so I don't have many choices." Pan Duola immediately said in surprise, "I just mentioned it, and you even thought about it? It seems that your noble house is determined to win this year's school championship competition?" Dake. "I don't really understand this problem." After staying in the library for an entire afternoon, Dake went to the club classroom. After an entire afternoon of tiredness, he wanted to enter the club classroom to have a good rest, but he didn't expect to be greeted by a clamor as soon as he opened the door. The club classroom was in a state of chaos. The little Osiris that was born less than 24 hours ago was bouncing around like a fat rubber ball. The Yagu beast was chasing it in a hurry, and the floor was covered in bird feathers. The Osiris grew fast, but this one seemed to grow even faster. The other members in the club classroom were all sitting on the sofa and doing their own things as if they were used to this. Their enthusiasm for the wonder of animals seemed to have been exhausted by the course of the afternoon. Dake carefully closed the door and walked in quietly. But the Osiris suddenly turned its head in the middle of running, and then let out an excited bird cry. It turned around and slid under the Yagu beast's arm, and rolled towards Dake. Dake's mind raced, and in a few seconds, he chose between dodging and attacking. He then bent down and picked up the Osiris. The Osiris immediately stuck to his face and giggled. As he laughed, Dake suddenly realized that the movements in his arms were much quieter. He lowered his head slightly and saw that the Osiris had closed its eyes and was breathing evenly. Obviously, it had fallen asleep. "Dake, The Yagu beast walked over with its arms slumped, looking depressed. Dake patted its head, then bent down and put the Osiris in the Yagu beast's hands. The Yagu beast looked happy and carefully held the Osiris, then looked up at Dake again. Dake nodded at him, and the Yagu beast gently carried the Osiris into the room and placed it in the cradle. Then, he laid on the edge of the cradle and looked at the Osiris that had fallen asleep. He gently rocked the cradle with a gentle gaze. The afterglow of the sunset shone in through the window, and the room was mottled with light and shadow. Dake stood at the door and looked for a while, then retreated with a gratified expression. He was busy with his studies, and he had a lot of time to think. It was great to have the Yagu beast help take care of the magical animals in the club. Of course, even without the Yagu beast, he believed that the other magic elves would help. Especially Big Milk Can, he would definitely take good care of the Osiris. After sitting down in the president's office, Dake continued to study the curse cage. After the guidance of Panduola Sr., the research on the curse cage was basically in place, and he could try it out tomorrow. But before that, he still had an alchemy class to attend. Professor Ka Zayer's alchemy class was a class that attracted students of all grades in the school. Dake even heard that some of the 6th grade students who were about to apply for internships stopped because of this class. However, Professor Ka Zayer rejected the application of the 6th grade students and only accepted a total of 30 students from the 2nd grade to the 5th grade. He probably felt that the 6th grade students shouldn't delay their plans because of this elective class. It could be seen that he didn't think that his alchemy class was that special. However, the students didn't think so. It was night, and it was raining heavily. Dake Dimeng, who had returned to his dorm to sleep, was suddenly awakened by the sound of thunder. Then, there was a slight ripple in his heart, and he opened his eyes halfway through the night. The magic elves that sneaked to his side had already woken up, and they looked at the window with their glowing eyes. Dake quickly got out of bed and walked to the window in a few steps. He opened the door to the balcony and saw a drowned rat clinging to the balcony railing. Hawkman wrestling? Dake opened the railing and picked up the Hawkman wrestling down. The Hawkman wrestling immediately pointed in the direction of the club classroom and cried. Doc raised his head and looked at the brightly lit club classroom. He suddenly frowned, turned around, and went into the room to grab his card bag. Then, he put the Hawkman wrestling into the magic card and took out the flight spell. He picked up a jacket and was about to put it on his head. However, the monster suddenly climbed up his body and transformed into a raincoat in the blink of an eye. He immediately activated the flight spell and rushed out from the balcony to the spiral clock tower. The feathered serpent statue at the entrance of the tower opened its snake eyes almost instantly, and the light emitted from the snake eyes lit up the night sky. Dake landed in the corridor on the 10th floor of the spiral clock tower and rushed into the club classroom without thinking. However, the sound of crying coming from the classroom made him stop. At this time, another bolt of lightning struck. Boom! Dake relaxed and slowly walked to the room of the Ubisoft. On the way, he summoned the Hawkman wrestling again. The Hawkman wrestling subconsciously shook its feathers and found that there was no rainwater on its body. Doc smiled and pushed open the door of the room. The crying sound became louder and louder. The small room was filled with magic elves. The Sabegu beast looked at the crying Ubisoft in the cradle and didn't know what to do until Dake entered the room. It subconsciously turned its head and cried to its master, "What should I do? What should I do?" Dake took a deep breath and squatted down to hug the Sabegu beast. It seemed that until this moment, he remembered that the Sabegu beast he entrusted with a heavy responsibility was just a baby. "I did wrong this time." After comforting the Sabegu beast, Dake got up and looked at the Ubisoft in the cradle. The Ubisoft was awakened by the thunder and rain, and even the Sabegu beast couldn't calm it down. As for the magic elves in the club dormitory, other than the lion beast and the milk can, they were all children. After the lion beast's Beast King's ghost face, and the milk can's milk-feeding attack failed, the magic elves were completely out of ideas. What made them even more nervous was that when the little dream demon wanted to invade the Ubisoft's dream, it was caught by the lion beast and the Ubisoft suddenly began to lose its feathers. Its feathers didn't look like a newborn bird at all. The top of its head to its back was bright black, and the rest was snow white. It was very soft. However, such beautiful feathers were falling one by one. As the Ubisoft cried more and more, the feathers fell faster and faster. The Hawkman wrestling panicked and hurriedly rushed into the rain to seek help from its master. However, when Dake arrived, the Ubisoft's feathers had all fallen. In the cradle, there was a hairless bird crying non-stop. No, it didn't even have the shape of a bird. After the Ubisoft took off its feathers, it became a human. Dake looked at the wailing human baby in the cradle. He didn't try to stop the crying at first. Instead, he lifted the baby's small quilt and looked under it. So it really is a girl? According to the legends, the Ubisoft might be a monogamous reproduction. Dake lifted the quilt and carried the baby girl out of the cradle. Strangely enough, after the baby girl was carried, she gradually stopped crying. There was no need for Dake to think of a way to coax her. She tightly clung to Dake's chest and sobbed until she calmed down. Dake freed one of his hands, and the milk can immediately handed him a wet towel. With the wet towel, Dake carefully wiped away the tears and snot on the baby girl's face and rubbed it on her small face. Don't worry, the Ubisoft has the magical ability to take off its feathers and become a human girl. They can weave their feathers into a feather weave. After putting it on, they can return to their original form. Also, the Ubisoft is actually a nocturnal creature. After explaining, Dake carefully observed the Ubisoft's appearance after it turned into a baby girl. It seemed to have inherited the color of its feathers. Its skin was snow white and flawless. Its hair was jet black, and its eyes were also pitch black. But other than that, the baby girl's facial features gave him a very familiar feeling. After a while he muttered, "Her eyebrows are a bit like Lily's. Her ears are a bit pointy. As for her eyes, nose, and mouth, why do they look more and more like Joey?" Busy. The polymorph slid down from his body and reformed into the most familiar little Dake. Dake raised his head and chose not to look. But the polymorph suddenly became shorter and shorter. It went from a few years old to a baby of 1 or 2 years old. It was exactly the same as the Ubisoft. The magic elves repeatedly looked at the polymorph and the Ubisoft's faces. When they regained their smiles, there was a hint of envy hidden in their expressions. Although Dake didn't want to admit it, the Ubisoft did look very similar to him after it turned into a human. This resemblance was even greater than the resemblance between John, Joey, and himself. He couldn't help but feel worried. According to the Ubisoft's growth rate, it will only take 2 or 3 years for her to mature. When that time comes, she will turn into a human. The more he thought about it, the more afraid it became. Dake Dimming decided to give up thinking. The moon is bright, the wind is calm, the leaves cover the window lattice. The night heron's cry is like the sound of the zither. The sound of the zither is light, the tune is pleasant, the cradle swings gently. Daddy's baby, close your eyes. He hummed a lullaby and coaxed the baby to sleep. When the Ubisoft's breathing became stable again, Dake carefully put her back in the cradle. The feathers in the cradle suddenly moved on their own and flew back to her body one by one. When the last feather was attached, the Ubisoft had turned back into a bird. Its little wings hugged the edge of the quilt tightly and it slept soundly. The enchanted fairies that had been guarding it were relieved at the same time. Dake waited in the room for another half an hour. When the thunder completely disappeared and there was only a light drizzle outside, he put on the raincoat made from hundreds of monsters and activated the flying spell to return to the dormitory. Almost at the same time, the feathered serpent statue closed its eyes. The light released from its eyes completely disappeared as its eyelids closed. The night returned to its peaceful state. After the rain, dew dripped down from the castle's eaves. After a long time, it fell to the ground and shattered into fragments of light. When the morning came, the whispers of the students who were doing their morning exercises could be heard inside and outside the castle. Today, the Shang-Malian Academy was still full of vigor. As for the second-year Magus, he welcomed his first elective class with excitement and anticipation. Dake specially went to the club's classroom to play with the Ubisoft baby, who woke up early, for a while before returning to the castle with his shoulder bag. The alchemy class had begun. 5 in 1 10,000 plus. 0187/233. Chapter 557. Elective classes were usually set on Thursdays and Fridays. Occasionally, there would be elective classes from Monday to Wednesday. When arranging classes, the professors would also pay attention to not let the classes overlap. But if they couldn't avoid it, they could only inform the students and let them choose one of the two. For example, alchemy class and night class were the first class on Thursday morning and couldn't be taken at the same time. Transfiguration class was the same as astrology class, set on Thursday night. As for medical class, it was on Thursday afternoon. Dake chose two classes. One was alchemy class on Thursday morning, and the other was astrology class on Thursday night. Probably because he stayed in the club classroom for a long time, when he arrived at the alchemy class on the 4th floor of the castle, he found that the classroom was already full of people. He habitually entered from the back door. When he opened the door, the sound of the door opening attracted the attention of a few students in the back row, but that was it. The classroom could accommodate hundreds of people, but there were less than 30 people in it, ranging from 2nd grade to 5th grade students. The classroom was very quiet, not as noisy as the 1st and 2nd grade classrooms. Remember, https://m Vipcanchu. VIP. Even if they were talking to each other, they would try to lower their voices as much as possible. Most of the people were quietly reading. Alchemy class wasn't an easy subject to learn. Its practicality was far inferior to Introduction to Magic in this era, but the learning difficulty was much higher. Students who chose alchemy class, even if they only came because of its reputation, usually had an extremely high learning ability. In other words, the students in the classroom were all top students of their respective grades. Dake slowed down his pace and walked forward. He found that most of the people were sitting in the front row. It seemed that they wanted to better admire the master alchemist. The middle and back rows were almost empty. Considering that sitting in the last row was too unsociable, he sat a bit forward. Of course, he still sat near the window. The windows in the classroom were basically open, and the wind from outside carried a trace of the morning chill. After Dake sat down, he took out the magic language textbook. There was still some time before class, so he prepared to revise the magic language knowledge he learned yesterday. However, after flipping open the textbook, his gaze involuntarily swept across the classroom. Surprisingly, there were many familiar students in this classroom. In the 2nd year alone, there were Saraswati, A.I. Mametis, Eudora N. Wei, and Vanessa Bolt from the Clubhouse of Fools. When Dark saw the 2nd year class leader of the House of Fools again, his eyes finally showed some surprise. Professor Ka Zayer had only selected 5 2nd year students, one from each school. To be selected along with Sarah and A.I. Ma, this Vanessa Bolt must have some precious qualities that didn't show in her appearance. Dake paid more attention and looked at the students from the other grades. There were more 3rd year students than 2nd year students, but there were still 7 of them. Among the 7 3rd year students, the only one he knew by name was Elsie Kevin, the senior he had defeated in the cultivation tournament. Elsie Kevin had also won the Crimson Star Award in the 1st year and was one of the top students in the Noble Academy. Dake didn't think that he would one day be in the same classroom as this senior. However, he wasn't familiar with the other 3rd year students. Even if he met them in the castle, he wouldn't be able to remember their names. However, among the 4th year students, there were a few whose names he knew. The 4th year students could be said to be the most numerous in this classroom. Dake counted and found that there were 12 of them. The descendant of the famous winter sage, Winnie Scatty, was one of them. There was also another senior from the 4th year of the Magic Engineering Department, someone Doc was quite familiar with. Angelia Hudson. She was a 3rd year student who had only joined the Duel Club for the first time. Dake had a deep impression of her. Other than Winnie and Angelia, the 4th year student from the Noble Academy, Mike Owen, had also chosen this elective course. In addition, the 4th year student from the House of Fools, Tom Nixon, who was born in the slums and had a deal with the Blood Mistress, was also sitting alone in one of the rows. This senior, Tom Nixon, seemed to have a good relationship with the White Gouda because of the blood mistress. There are really more acquaintances in the 4th grade than I imagined. Dake smacked his lips and finally looked at the 5th-year students. There were only 6 5th-year students. Unfortunately, Pan Duola Doragon wasn't among them. Dake didn't pay much attention to the other 5th-year students and could only recognize one of them as the current head of the duel club, Inia Knight from the Knights Academy. The other person was the fairy princess, Iluri Clarissa. This senior, who had royal blood and was known as the princess, had appeared in the Easter Duel Festival, but after 30 rounds of fierce battle, she lost to the dragon slayer Luke Beige. Other than that, he couldn't name the other 4 people. But thinking about it, they were all outstanding students. Dake only observed for a moment before retracting his gaze. Although it felt good to be able to attend class with so many outstanding seniors, the seniors wouldn't help him. However, the seniors would not help you learn. In the end, what you could learn and how much you could learn would depend on yourself. Dake quickly focused on the textbook. But not long after, a pink-haired sweetheart quietly moved something to the seat on his right. Dake glanced sideways and noticed that Eudora was staring at the table. Her ears were red and she was in a state of complete isolation where she had lost her ability to communicate. He couldn't help but smile helplessly, but he didn't deliberately let her go. Today was different from the past. Dake Dimeng was no longer the youth who could be easily aroused by bliss. He had a considerable degree of luxury. Ring ring ring. As the class bell rang, Professor Ka Zayer walked into the classroom very steadily. When he reached the podium, his height suddenly jumped by a lot. Dake, who was experienced in this, naturally knew that there was a stool hidden under the podium. Professor Ka Zayer waved his magic wand lightly, and the flickering fluorescence left waves in the air. He was full of energy, smiled, and said in a kind tone, "Thank you very much for choosing this alchemy course. Although alchemy is already the embers of the era, we can always find some remaining sparks from the embers. I hope that in the next year, you can also learn something beneficial to your own growth from my class. If that's the case, I'll be satisfied." His voice seemed to have its own magic, and the 30 students below the stage couldn't help but focus their attention. Professor Ka Zayer's gaze swept across the faces of the 30 students for a moment, then he smiled and said, "As for the self-introduction, there's no need for that for now. I already know each of your names, so I'm sure you all know my name." Even so, he still wrote his name on the blackboard. Then he continued, "At the beginning of the class, I want to know how much you know about alchemy. Who wants to share your opinion? What is alchemy? What is alchemy?" Dake couldn't help but think. His understanding of alchemy was actually more derived from the information gathered from various works in his previous world. He didn't have a deep understanding of alchemy in this world. Alchemy was like magic. It required a large amount of knowledge as a prerequisite, which made people flinch. However, if he had to generalize, he still had some understanding of what alchemy was. However, just as he was about to take the initiative to raise his hand, he realized that there were already arms in front of him. "Good students, you really know how to answer." Doc couldn't help but put down the hand that he had just raised and prepared to be a listener. Professor Ka Zayer's gaze immediately swept across the students. Then he pointed at AI Ma. AI Ma immediately stood up. Even though she was in class with so many senior students, she didn't seem to be nervous. Her voice was as clear as ever. "The so-called alchemy, in my opinion, is actually a kind of transaction. Alchemists pay a price and make a transaction with the gate of truth, thereby obtaining an equivalent return. This is alchemy." As AI Ma spoke her opinion, the senior students had different expressions, but most of them put down their hands and carefully chewed. Professor Ka Zayer's face showed a visible smile, then he immediately raised his voice and said, not bad at all. Although there are slight flaws in the sentence, this is indeed an explanation of alchemy. AI Ma Matiska, 5 points. So, student Kevin, what new ideas do you have? Elsie Kevin stood up, first glanced at AI Ma who had already sat down, then said, "Student AI Ma Matiska and I have different understandings. Although alchemy has always been labeled as equivalent exchange, how do you measure the value of something? What we think is equivalent, is it really equivalent in alchemy? Even in the ordinary market, the value of everything changes with time, not to mention materials used in alchemy. Therefore, alchemy can't be a simple equivalent exchange. Professor Zayer's eyebrows moved, then he smiled and said, "Good idea. So, what do you think alchemy is?" Elsie Kevin couldn't help but straighten her back and said, "I personally think that alchemy is magic. Although there are differences in the name and the casting methods are different, alchemy is alchemy. However, alchemy is undoubtedly the same as magic. It also requires the support of magic and is also used to create extraordinary items." Professor Zayer was obviously very happy with Elsie Kevin's eclectic answer. He clapped his hands and said, "Everything can be seen from different angles. Try to do it, think about it, and then there will be new discoveries." 5 points for Elsie Kevin. "Tom Nixon, you're here." Tom Nixon of the 4th grade House of Fools stood up, and there was a hint of ridicule in his eyes from under his black bangs. He glanced at Elsie Kevin and said, "Professor, you can't just indulge your students. If this Junior Kevin's words were in ancient times, when alchemy was popular, he would be arrested and burned to death. The equivalent exchange of alchemy is not something that can be compared with market prices. Junior Kevin thinks that the value of an item can change at any time, so it can't be measured. But as long as you have some understanding of alchemy, the value of alchemy is originally different from general knowledge. Its standard has always been engraved in the Gate of Truth. And the Gate of Truth has long been proven to exist." Elsie Kevin heard the ridicule in his words and suddenly frowned. "I didn't deny the principle of equivalent exchange. Moreover, has the Gate of Truth a standard for measuring the value of an item remained unchanged for thousands of years? If so, why are most of the alchemy formulas handed down from ancient times unusable?" Tom Nixon looked at him and raised his eyebrows. "That's what I want to learn." Seeing that the two were about to argue, Professor Zayer quickly interrupted. "It's not a bad thing to have one more opinion and one more train of thought. Does anyone have a different opinion?" At this time, most of the students in the classroom had already put down their hands. But when Professor Zayer asked again, someone raised their hand again. Zayer raised his magic wand and pointed at her. Winnie Scotty stood up and attracted the attention of the whole classroom. Whether it was the 3rd or 5th grade, they were all paying attention to her. She put her hand on the book and said, "Alchemy, in my opinion, is a tool to explore the truth. Alchemists, in order to spy on the inside of the Gate of Truth, excavate the truth from the Gate of Truth, and find ways to make the Gate of Truth react. And these methods are alchemy." Tom Nixon immediately retorted, "How can alchemists be so noble? In the beginning, alchemy was just a technology developed for the purpose of refining gold. He used to be a very low-key person, but after he displayed his brilliance in the Easter Festival of Extinction, he changed his usual self and became high-profile." However, Winnie Scotty obviously didn't want to pay attention to him. She just sat down after answering the question. It was just like a formulaic way to harvest credits. Professor Zayer motioned Tom Nixon to sit down, then waved his magic wand and said, "Where did alchemy come from, and why did it come from, is a question that has not been settled. Some people say that alchemy is a technology that ancient alchemists researched in order to make gold, and some people use alchemy as a tool to explore the Gate of Truth, and some people even study alchemy for the purpose of longevity. The river of history is too long, and we have long been unable to explore it. But we can know where alchemy is going, and we can grasp it with our own hands. Now, turn to the first page of the Secrets of Alchemy." Just when the students were wondering where the Secrets of Alchemy was, a golden light lit up in front of everyone without warning. Professor Zayer stretched out his magic wand and a thick Secrets of Alchemy appeared in the golden light. Dake lowered his head slightly and saw the teaching material. Secrets of Alchemy could be called a book of gold. Before it was opened, it was like a gold brick, and the gold on the cover seemed to flow at any time. According to Professor Zayer's instructions, he turned to the first page. A small scale was drawn in the middle of the page, and below the scale were the words, "Equivalent Exchange." no matter how the value of a thing was measured. But equivalent exchange was still the basic principle of alchemy. In other words, measuring value was the responsibility of the gate of truth, and paying the price was the obligation of the alchemist. The fairness and justice of alchemy was based on the fairness and justice of the gate of truth. Dake turned to the second page and saw the title of the first chapter in the table of contents, Value. Before an alchemist mastered alchemy, the first task was to clarify the value of anything. From the perspective of the gate of truth, the alchemist evaluated the value of things. Only after confirming the value can they be placed on the same scale as wishes. The first alchemists didn't know the key. They evaluated the value of things from their own perspective. They thought that weeds must be worthless, and diamonds must be valuable. But from the perspective of the gate of truth, diamonds are weeds most of the time. As for alchemists who can't provide enough valuable items, they will either fail in refining or be devoured by the gate of truth, as greedy people. Of course, as Elsie Kevin said, the value of things in the gate of truth eyes changes all the time. Therefore, we need to use a secret technique, the eye of truth. The eye of truth is a secret technique developed in the later stages of alchemy. After a powerful alchemist established a connection with the gate of truth, they successfully developed it. It allows us to measure the value of things from the perspective of the gate of truth. The closer the connection with the gate of truth, the higher the precision of the eye of truth. Our next main topic is to master the eye of truth. Professor Ka Zayer's teaching style had always been very simple. Other than occasionally interspersing a few lame jokes in the class, he had a very good grasp of the key points of the class. Whether it was to warn the students through examples or to leave a sense of expectation for the future, it was all very easy. For example, in this class, seeing that the students were not interested in the eye of truth, he directly gave several examples and vividly described several very serious alchemy accidents in history. From the death of an alchemist to the destruction of a glorious country. Most of the alchemy accidents caused by alchemists due to the failure of alchemy were due to the mismeasurement of value. Without paying enough, forcibly opening the gate of truth was an act of self-destruction. These serious accidents in history finally alerted the students. 30 minutes before the end of the first alchemy class, Professor Ka Zayer stopped the lecture, put down the textbook, and said, "Today's theory lecture will end here for the time being. Next, I will lead you into the gate of truth, and feel the truth." The words that he said casually set off a storm below the stage. The second and third years didn't react for a while, but the fourth and fifth years were noisy in an instant. Even if they didn't have much contact with alchemy, the accumulation of knowledge was not a straight line. In the midst of the noisy crowd, Winnie Scardy suddenly raised her hand up high. When Professor Ka Zayer asked her to stand up and ask questions, her tone was even more excited than when she was on the duel stage. "Professor Ka Zayer, can we really enter the gate of truth?" Professor Ka Zayer smiled. "It's not difficult." "It's not difficult?" The classroom suddenly exploded, and the students' exclamations and discussions became louder and louder. Dake pressed his hand on the textbook and tried to demonstrate the shock in his heart. He had always placed Professor Ka Zayer in a very high position, but he didn't expect that he still underestimated him. Many alchemists spent their whole lives trying to touch the gate of truth. They even sacrificed their lives for it. However, not only did Professor Ka Zayer already touch the gate of truth, but he could even bring people in. Anyone who knew a little about this would know how terrifying it was. This was equivalent to allowing someone to directly access and understand the mysteries of calculus without even knowing the multiplication table. The point was, he could really do it. Greed +1. Dake ignored the indicator in front of him and raised his hand. Professor Ka Zayer found him in the crowd and raised his magic wand. Dake understood and stood up and asked, "Professor, what can we get after entering the gate of truth?" Professor Ka Zayer said kindly, "Touch the truth, and you can feel the truth." After leaving a mark in the gate of truth, it will be easier to establish a connection and receive a response from the gate of truth. After establishing a connection with the gate of truth, you can open the eye of truth. Of course, this is only one of the more practical effects. Everyone has different gains after entering the gate of truth. You will gradually know after entering. Dake sat down after getting a satisfactory answer, but then someone raised his hand and said, "Professor, it is not safe inside the gate of truth, right?" Professor Ka-Zayer smiled and said, "Follow me, and you will be safe." The students suppressed their excitement and fear and raised their hands to ask questions one after another. Professor Ka-Zayer also patiently answered their questions. It was not until 10 minutes before the end of the class that he suppressed the noise in the classroom and said with a smile, "After entering the gate of truth, you have 5 minutes to feel it. If you are lucky enough to get the favor of the gate of truth, you may be able to get the truth's answer. Students who are ready, put your head down. Yes, put your head on the table." The students responded one after another. They put their hands on the table, put their hands on their heads, and lay down. After Dake lay down, he noticed Eudora secretly looking at him from the corner of his eye, so he winked at her. Eudora's face suddenly turned red, and she buried her head in her arms. Professor Ka-Zayer's voice came into everyone's ears. "Close your eyes and listen to my voice. Even if the surrounding environment doesn't change, don't be surprised. The truth exists in the heart, and the gate of truth will open in the heart." The classroom gradually quieted down, and the little mages' hearts gradually calmed down. The complicated thoughts gradually smoothed out under the guidance of Professor Ka-Zayer, and the heart settled into the center. A magic card appeared in Professor Ka-Zayer's hand. The edge of the magic card flashed with colorful glazed light, and the card surface was engraved with a door that was twisted like a vortex. This was the Gate of Truth. It was a masterpiece that combined alchemy and magic technology. There was no second magic card in this world. Professor Ka-Zayer poured magic power into the Gate of Truth magic card, and the door on the card surface rotated. The whole picture gradually turned into chaos, and finally, only a very black dot was left. Almost at the same time, the same black dot appeared on the ceiling. This black dot rotated in the opposite direction and reopened into a golden door that contained chaos. The whole classroom was dyed with a golden color, shining brightly. Professor Ka-Zayer slowly closed his eyes, but the students' eyes opened in their hearts. A water droplet fell rapidly from a very high place. Dake Dimming suddenly opened his eyes. There's no sound around. There's no color around. The most intuitive perception of a person was sound and light, followed by other elements such as smell. Dake was sure that he was no longer in the classroom, but he was in the classroom again. The entire classroom lost its color and became a ghastly white. The students lying on the table, the professor standing on the podium, the birds flying outside the window, and the blooming flowers all disappeared without a trace. Although this was different from the Gate of Truth, he imagined, he didn't panic. Even if the surrounding environment hasn't changed, don't be surprised. It hasn't changed, but it's not completely unchanged. Dake stood up from his seat. The whole world was white, and even he himself was pale. Other than him, there was nothing that could move. It felt like time had stopped. He walked out of his seat and subconsciously walked to the podium, but nothing changed. So where is the Gate of Truth? Dake stood on the podium and fell into deep thought. He wasn't sure if he was the only one who experienced this scene, or if everyone was the same. He originally thought that his consciousness would appear in front of a huge door, and that as long as he stepped through that door, he would be able to reach the Gate of Truth. Even if he couldn't comprehend the mystery of the Gate of Truth, as long as he could leave some traces to open the Eye of Truth, it would be enough. But the Gate of Truth seemed to be playing a joke on him. He turned around and walked to the door, trying to open it. The door opened smoothly. He hesitated for a moment, then stretched out his foot a little. When the tip of his foot touched the ground, he suddenly jumped out. There was no obstruction at all. So he began to walk down the corridor. There was still no sound, no color, no smell, and no moving life other than him. It was as if he had entered a pale world where time had stopped. He even walked out of the castle and spent more than 5 minutes, but he still found nothing. There was no Gate of Truth. There was no Gate of Truth. There was nothing. Unknowingly, Dake had returned to the classroom, to the seat where he opened his eyes. He sat down again, then leaned on the table, maintaining the same position with his eyes closed. He hoped that when he opened his eyes again, the world would regain its color. But it didn't. He looked at the classroom that was still pale and colorless, and an extreme irritation suddenly surged in his heart. The Fury +1 that flashed before his eyes made him have a bad feeling. But that irritation couldn't be controlled no matter what. He tried to use the underworld god spell in this world of consciousness. But he couldn't do anything. The structure of this world of consciousness was terrifyingly sturdy, and it was impossible to twist it with the beginner, underworld god spell. So his irritation went up a level, and fury erupted like a volcano. The gate of truth. As if to vent this anger, the air that was squeezed out of his abdomen went all the way through his throat and burst out. Dake Dimming slammed the table and stood up. Then, the world suddenly collapsed. The collapsed bricks turned into yellow sand, and the whole world turned into an endless desert. The sudden collapse of the surface caused the gold diggers in the desert to be washed into the ground by the turbulent yellow sand. A corner of the ancient city was exposed to the blazing sun as the yellow sand fell, and the gold that covered the city shone brilliantly. Dake floated in the air like a ghost. Fury calmed down in an instant, and his eyes were filled with surprise and curiosity. This is the old site of the Golden Kingdom, the scene recorded in The Golden King and the Secret Treasure. AI Ma Metissa's voice sounded excitedly. I know where it is. Dake turned his head abruptly, but found that there was no one beside him. AI Ma's voice continued to sound, as if she didn't notice that there was a transparent ghost-like eavesdropper beside her. The collapse of the desert didn't stop because of the appearance of the Golden City. Instead, it continued to intensify. The black hole underground grew bigger and bigger, and the entire desert was swallowed by the black hole. In this apocalyptic scene, the scene in his field of vision collapsed again. When Dake came back to his senses again, he found himself sitting on a stool. There were no extra decorations around the stool, and it was surrounded by a narrow square space without any doors or windows. This time, he didn't stay for too long. It seemed that only half a minute had passed before the world suddenly started to spin, and his consciousness was swallowed by chaos. In the classroom, Professor Ka Zayer opened his eyes, and the golden door on the ceiling quietly disappeared. The students opened their eyes almost at the same time. Some people looked up with a blank expression, some people's eyes were bright, and some people suddenly stood up with lingering fear. Don't panic. Professor Ka Zayer's voice flowed into everyone's heart, and gradually calmed down their intense emotions. When the students wanted to speak, he said again, Don't speak. Hide truth in your heart. The students suddenly closed their mouths tightly. After Dake opened his eyes, he calmed down. He subconsciously turned his head to look at AI Ma and noticed that AI Ma was also looking back at him. The two looked at each other, and AI Ma immediately turned her head back. Dake chuckled in his heart. AI Ma learned the location of the Golden Country from the Door of Truth. She must be eager to tell him this news. But Professor Ka Zayer's words made her shut her mouth. As for why Professor Ka Zayer said this, it was probably based on the rule that the secrets of heaven cannot be revealed. Or, after saying it out loud, he had to pay an extra price. This price might not be high, but of course, it was better not to pay. However, if both of them knew, it wouldn't be considered a leak. Dake was more concerned about how to explain to AI Ma that he peeked at her truth. After going back, digest today's experience well. We will explain the composition of Eye of Truth in the next class. Professor Ka Zayer left the classroom after the bell rang, but he didn't leave any homework. But the 30 students in the classroom were obviously not in the mood to think about homework. Some people's faces were flushed. They seemed to want to talk about their experiences in the Door of Truth. Some people immediately picked up their notes and buried their heads in notes. Some people looked left and right with a face full of curiosity. They were obviously very concerned about the experiences of others. It wasn't until a few minutes later that someone walked out of the classroom first. After that, the students gradually dispersed, and there were fewer and fewer people in the classroom. Dake waited until half of the people left before getting up. Eudora, who was beside him, had already packed up, but she had been sitting there motionless. "It's time to go," Dake reminded helplessly. "Oh. Where are you going?" Eudora said quickly. Dake smiled and said, "I should be going to the club classroom." "Huh?" Eudora suddenly showed a very obvious disappointment. Dake's club classroom was on the spiral clock tower outside the castle. No matter what, it was impossible for him to go the same way as her. She originally wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to walk alone with Doc for a while. Days like this where Anna and Luoc were not by Dake's side were rare. "Then I'll go first." Dake waved at her and turned to leave the classroom. Eudora couldn't help but clench her small fist in front of her chest and comfort herself. There will still be opportunities in the future. After leaving the classroom, Dake didn't walk in the direction of the club classroom. He quickly found AI Ma's back and deliberately swayed in front of her. AI Ma's mouth twitched. In the end, she couldn't help but stop and grab the window to look at the scenery outside the castle before he left. He didn't have any other intention. He just wanted to make her look like she wanted to say something but couldn't. Rage -1. This trip to the Gate of Truth is really a double loss. Forget it, I'll just use rage as the next research object. Dake glanced at the index of rage. It was calm. Rage didn't exceed 100. It was still within the error tolerance range. He picked up his shoulder bag and walked to the spiral clock tower. After climbing the clock tower and pushing open the door of the club classroom, Dake suddenly raised his eyebrows. He saw little Dake on the sofa holding little Dake and telling a story. Changeable monster. Even his voice when he was young was imitated very well. The tone of his storytelling was also quite similar. He spoke tirelessly and captivatingly. And Miss Bird, who had taken off her feathers again, was holding his arm and laughing. He didn't know if she was playing with the horizontal bar or listening to the story. In the club classroom, only Luoc was doing homework on the other side. Anna hadn't come back yet. "Class is over?" Luoc looked up and asked. Dake looked away from Miss Bird and saw Yagu walking out of another room with a plate of apple puree in his hand. Luoc asked curiously, "What does alchemy teach?" Dake sighed. "It's hard to explain." It was indeed hard to explain. His experience was completely different from AI Ma's. He couldn't understand what the Gate of Truth was trying to tell him. However, it was fine to talk about some things that had nothing to do with it. "It's so nice to be in the same class as Sister Winnie." Luoc was a bit envious after hearing Dake's explanation. But why was he so envious? Dake asked curiously, "Don't you want to enter the Gate of Truth?" Rose smiled and said, "Of course I do. But surely not everyone can enter that place, right? Professor Zaire is very strict with the students. It's probably because of talent." Dake shook his head. "If Professor Zaire still has classes next year, you can sign up." Luoc smiled, "Then I'll give it a try." While the two were talking, the door of the club classroom was suddenly pushed open. Deanna ran in happily. Her forehead was covered in sweat, but she didn't seem tired at all. Instead, she looked excited and her cheeks were slightly red. "Seems like you learned a lot from this night class?" Dake smiled. Deanna nodded vigorously. "Of course. I'm the only second-year student in the class who tamed a devil beast." "Devil beast?" Doc paused for a moment and asked. Deanna said, "Aren't devil beasts a subspecies of the earth dragon? Professor Wesley found a group of devil beasts and asked us to try taming them one by one. You don't know, that idiot Doran wanted to touch the devil beasts but when he saw it, but he was sent flying by its tail." "Ha ha ha," Dake said. "Wesley?" Deanna said, "Carlos Wesley, the professor of the third-year dueling class. He's so powerful. He made the group of devil beasts lie down and stop moving with just a stare." "What about White and Luo Boat?" Dake asked curiously. Anna sat down and started from the beginning. She was obviously in high spirits and finished everything in a blink of an eye. The full name of the night class was Night Cultivation Class. The main content was night cultivation and related magic card system composition. However, at the beginning of the class, Wesley's classroom only taught night cultivation. It started from standing still, marching, holding a sword, and so on. The first half of the class was boring and unbearable, but the second half of the class changed to riding training, which made the 30 students excited. Most of the students who were recruited for the night class were second-year and third-year students, and most of them were from the Academy of Knights. The third-year students had some experience, so their performance in riding training was not bad. Although there were many second-year students who had done night training, devil beasts were a subspecies of dragon that relied on its hind legs to stand upright. They were very strong and bad-tempered, so they were very difficult to ride. Doran was sent flying by a tail. Luo Boat was thrown off the back of a devil beast as soon as he climbed onto its back. White won the favor of a devil beast, but was immediately threatened by another devil beast. He was so scared that his soul almost left his body. I heard from Professor Wesley that the two devil beasts are a couple, ha ha ha. Anna's laughter was very healing. 5 in 1 10,000 plus. 0190/233 hour asterisk. Asterisk 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 asterisk, star. Chapter 558. Even though Anna made it sound interesting, it was actually quite dangerous to have this kind of situation in the night class. However, since she didn't mention this point, maybe those devil beasts were good at stopping when necessary. It was even possible that they deliberately simulated the difficulty of the class. After all, the intelligence of the sky dragons was usually not low. However, when it came to riding training, Dake was really interested. He had ridden the green-eyed sky white dragon before returning to school, and he had never tried it again. Even though the Shang Malian Academy was spacious enough, the school rules clearly forbade riding. Only with the temporary permission of the professors or joining the riding club could one practice riding in the club's special field. In the duel competition, there was a competition mode called Riding Duel. It was quite popular recently, and it had a trend of becoming popular. After Anna finished talking, Dake gave her a cup of black tea and walked to the sofa where the Ubisoft and the shapeshifter were. The Ubisoft was very sensitive to his scent. Since he entered the room, she had been reaching out her chubby little hands to touch him. First website. https://m. Vipkanchu. VIP. When Dake walked in front of her, she struggled to crawl out of the shapeshifter's arms and cried at Dake. Doc's heart trembled violently. He bent down and clumsily hugged the bird in his arms, mimicking the actions of the newlywed parents. The Ubisoft immediately calmed down. She clenched her fingers into fists and laid in Dake's arms, rubbing her face against his chest. After that, it was impossible to put her down. Dake had no choice but to sit on the sofa. He took the spoon from the Yagu and fed her the apple puree bit by bit. He hugged her for 2 to 3 hours. When the Ubisoft put on her feathers and fell asleep, Dake was finally released. After that, he left the club's classroom, ate his meal, and went back to his dorm. Then, he dove into the experiment. The problem with the curse cage was basically solved. Next, it was time for the official experiment. He bought a total of 3 sets of curse cage materials, but because the remaining materials could be used, the chances of trial and error were actually greater than 2. However, an archmage couldn't always think about trial and error before they started their training. Soul imprint was the attitude an archmage should have. Dake calmed down and began refining the curse cage. In theory, the spell cage belonged to the category of magic cards, but in fact, it had always been regarded as a magic elven card in the duel competition. Using the curse cage, he could temporarily seal demonic spirits, golems, and other simulated life forms and use them as magic elf cards. Its refining method was also compatible with both the magic elf card and the magic spell card. The first half of the process required the creation of the life foundation like how one would create a magic elf card, while the second half required the engraving of a magic spell card. In the process of concocting the potion, Dake quickly focused and entered the zone. His first attempt did not go as smoothly as he had expected. A slight error in the amount of materials used led to the failure of the entire experiment. However, Dake quickly adjusted his state and perfectly avoided the previous mistake in his second attempt. In the end, he successfully refined a new curse cage. This success was completely within his grasp, so Dake was not too surprised. After muttering to himself for a while, he took advantage of the fact that his hands were hot and began the third experiment. An entire afternoon passed quickly, and Dake had 2 new curse cages in his hands. 2 curse cages. One will be used to seal the sub-ancient beast, and the other will be kept as a backup. Dake couldn't help but feel happy. The caution and effort he had put in for the past few days had finally paid off. No matter what simulated life form was sealed in the curse cage, it was regarded as a card of the same name in the duel. Only 3 of them could be placed. Now that 3 of them were gathered, there was still an empty slot. Dake's eyes turned slightly as he thought about whether there was a chance to obtain a different type of demonic spirit. The Academy's branch card and society card are both unique. Unless I disband the society and rebuild it, I might be able to obtain a new society card. However, the original society card might also be taken back, so it's not very reliable. Maybe I should change my mind and use the third curse cage to seal golems instead of demonic spirits? Dake couldn't help but rub his chin and ponder. It just so happens that I have an elective alchemy class this year. Let's aim to refine a simulated class golem. As a product of alchemy, golems had always been divided into 2 classes. One class was based on the golem's attack, defense, speed, flexibility, endurance, and other combat strength factors. The other class was based on the similarity between a golem and a real life form. In the era before the concept of reality was expanded, the classes of golems weren't detailed enough. There were only 5 classes, which were 1. Simulated class. A poor imitation. 2. Similar class. Has a certain degree of similarity to a real life form. 3. Simulated class. Partially similar to a real life form, has a simulated thinking circuit, intelligence level of 2. 5. 4. Simulated class. The structure is almost the same as a real life form, almost no difference can be seen. Intelligence level exceeds 3. 5. True class. This is a real life form. To give a few examples that were more recognizable, the patrolling golems in the Academy were level 3, simulated class. As for marionettes refined from living metals, they were at the 4th level, the simulated grade. As for level 5 true class golems, Dake had always suspected that the guardian golem of the noble house's tower, the feathered serpent, was a true class golem. Of course, he only suspected and wasn't certain. Only a master alchemist could refine a level 4, realistic grade golem. Dake obviously wasn't arrogant enough to think that he could grasp master alchemy with just a year of study. Thus, he only set his goal at level 3, simulated class. If he could successfully refine a simulated class golem, it would be considered an achievement in alchemy. But if this is my goal, I'm afraid it's not enough to just rely on studying in class. Dake calmed himself down, and his plan for this semester became clearer. Then, he cleaned up the remnants of the experiment, fed the cat grass cat juice, and took the things he needed for the astrology class, and left the tower. Tonight's astrology class was after 7:30 p.m., and it was only 4:30 p.m. He still had a long time to rest. When he arrived at the club classroom, Luo C had already finished the medical class, and was doing homework with Deanna in the living room. Katrina, on the other hand, had moved a reclining chair to the circular corridor. She was reading a book while enjoying the scenery from above. It was very peaceful. Brittany seemed to have something to do and wasn't in the club classroom. "How's Sister Carl Yen's class?" Dake walked into the club classroom and asked casually. "It's not bad." Luo C raised her head and said, "Many seniors have signed up for medical school, saying that they want to learn medicine and save people." Learning medicine alone won't save people. Dake sat down and turned his head to look for the sub-beast. Luosi couldn't help but put down her pen and asked curiously, "What do you mean?" Dake faced her, pointed at his temple, and smiled. Humans are made up of 3 parts: the soul, the body, and the consciousness. Ordinary medical skills can heal the body, and extraordinary medical skills can repair the soul. But the consciousness and the mind don't need medical skills. Luosi frowned slightly and said, "But Sister Kalien told us that the consciousness and the mind can also be saved by medical skills. Psychological medicine was created for this purpose." Dake shook his head. "You'll understand in the future." After that, he saw the sub-beast coming out with a diaper, so he walked over. After changing the diaper with the sub-beast, Dake tapped the sub-beast's head and led it to the open space between the 6 classrooms. The sub-beast seemed to have a premonition, and its eyes were filled with excitement. As Dake's only tamed demon, the sub-beast and the little demonic beast communicated quite frequently. Although most of the time, it was the little demonic beast who was showing off, and the sub-beast only listened, it indeed knew a lot. It was a digitalized beast born for battle. It wasn't a tamed demon that had no offensive capabilities. Curse Cage would give it a new life. "Are you ready?" Dake took out a Curse Cage card from his card pack and asked the sub-beast. The sub-beast sniffed subconsciously. Although it didn't sniff any information from the card, it still nodded its head vigorously. At the same time, cute little heads popped out from various passages, and their eyes were bright and full of spirit. Obviously, the magical elves had expected Dake to come to the club classroom, and they immediately seized the opportunity to surround him. Dake didn't care about being seen. After the sub-beast nodded its head, he tapped the curse cage on the sub-beast's head, and the wooden cage on the card surface faintly glowed. "In the name of Dake Dim-Eng, magical summoning." In the blink of an eye, it was activated. Dake could clearly feel a large amount of magic being absorbed into the card, and it was obviously shrouding the sub-beast. The sub-beast widened its eyes, and it was fearless. Then, it felt the wooden floor under its feet rising, and it was lifted up. Then, railings went straight down, and in the blink of an eye, they were all around, and a wooden cover was quickly sealed on top of it. A wooden cage was formed just like that. Dake took a few steps back. Golden magical runes appeared on every surface of the wooden cage, and they flowed upwards, and finally merged into a huge curse word on top of the cage. The sub-beast subconsciously raised its head and saw the curse word pressing down from top to bottom. Almost instantly, the wooden cage and the sub-beast were flattened by the curse word, and it turned into a piece of paper with the word curse written on it. Then, the curse word suddenly turned into light and drilled into the curse cage card in Dake's hand. Dake looked down, and on the surface of the card, there was a small yellow dinosaur in the wooden cage. "Is this the curse cage?" After the sub-beast circled around the curse cage, it turned back to look at its master outside the card surface. Dake habitually stretched out his finger, wanting to poke its little belly, but he only poked the hard wooden cage. He smiled and said, "How is it? Are you used to it?" The sub-beast clenched its fist and shook its head. It didn't want to be in the curse cage. The purpose of entering the curse cage was to fight better. Dake saw that it was in a hurry, so he directly summoned it out of the curse cage, and then inputted magic to check the information. Card name, sub-beast. Type, sprite card. Level, for all, race, dragon. Attribute, dragon/fire. Magic power, 500 attack, 700 defense, 400 ultimate skill, small flame. Although it was an extremely rare 2-star familiar, it was still a non-aggressive familiar. Curse cage, sub-beast's magic power, attack, and defense belong to the lower sequence among the 2-star familiars. After transforming into a normal magical sprite through the curse cage, it had mastered the most proficient ultimate skill, small flame. Small flame, spit out a flame breath in the shape of a fireball from its mouth to burn the enemy. In concept, small flame was equivalent to the dragon's breath of the dragon species. Its power was definitely higher than the average attack, and its cooldown was not long. It was a conventional ultimate skill. In fact, Dark had already seen the sub-ancient beast's small flame in the dormitory, so he wasn't prepared this time. A scorching hot aura suddenly rose, and the sub-ancient beast that appeared was already excitedly spitting out fire. Dake looked at its satisfied expression and couldn't help but smile. After the sub-beast was born, it hadn't actually participated in or watched a duel. It was still in a state where it didn't know what a real battle was. It didn't know what true strength was. Even if it was full of battle intent, it was as weak as a chicken. However, this could all be changed. It just needed to evolve a little bit. Dake had done research on magical sprites like the digital beast. Before the sub-beast was born, the little demon beast was extremely special. From the beginning, it wasn't tainted by any great sin, so it had a high possibility of evolving according to the different types of great sin. This wasn't just because it was a little demon beast. Although the demon fox beast was also a growing digital beast, it couldn't rely on Pride 3 and Greed 3 to evolve. Instead, it could only rely on Bliss 3 to evolve. Other than the fact that the evolution path of the demon fox beast was limited, it was also because it was a creation of Bliss. From the moment it was born, it already had a home. Under normal circumstances, it could only follow the established path to the end. This situation was very similar to the digital beasts in the Digimon anime. They all only had one orthodox evolution path. Fortunately, the demon fox was originally a digital beast that was very compatible with Bliss. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been able to be refined so smoothly. Similarly, there should be the Diru beast. Dake's Diru beast could only rely on Pride to evolve. Unless one day, Dake could master all 7 great sins. Perhaps there would be a change. But now he had the sub-beast. Like the little demon beast, the sub-beast not only had many evolution possibilities, but it also didn't have a fixed path by a single great sin. Pride, bliss, greed. With the help of these 3 great sins, can the sub-beast activate multiple evolution paths like the little demon beast? With a hint of doubt and anticipation, Dake took out the new Pride 2, Pride 3, and Pride 4 cards from his card pack. Before the astrology class at night, he still had at least 2 hours to experiment. In a series of Great Sin cards, the higher-level Great Sin cards could completely override the lower-level Great Sin cards. This way, he didn't have to wait for the sub-beast to evolve and degenerate before he could do the next round of experiments. I can do 2 rounds of experiments. Let's start with Pride, the only one that has the 4th level. Dake's eyes lit up as he said to the sub-beast, "Sub-beast, come here for a moment." "Okay, Dake." The sub-beast immediately retracted its flames and ran happily towards Dake. Dake couldn't help but smile. He had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Anyone who had watched the first episode of Digimon would never forget the courage of the sub-beast and the power and coolness of the battle Tyrannosaurus. Among the 3 great sins, Pride was the only one that could activate Sub-Beast, Tyrannosaurus, Mechanical Tyrannosaurus, Battle Tyrannosaurus. Of course, it could also be Sub-Beast, Tyrannosaurus, Zombie Tyrannosaurus. If it mistakenly evolved into a Zombie Tyrannosaurus, with a budding bond between Dark and the ancient beast, they would have to defeat it. Dake calmed himself down and raised Pride 2. "Do you want to become stronger?" "Yes." The ancient beast nodded its head honestly. Dake smiled. "Then close your eyes." The sub-beast nodded. "Okay." 3 seconds after it closed its eyes, Pride's dark golden light shone on top of its head. With the appearance of the Pride emblem, the curse cage, sub-beast's data began to increase at an extremely fast rate. Dake's attention immediately turned to the curse cage, sub-beast. But unlike before, it wasn't just the data that changed. The sub-ancient beasts on the card surface had also undergone changes in their body shape. This change didn't happen to the little demonic beast, so it attracted Dake's attention. He couldn't help but look at it. He saw that not only was the sub-beast's body slightly bigger, but its skin had also become smoother and more textured. Its temperament had also changed slightly. It looked smarter. But the real difference between it and the sub-beast was that there were additional red belts on its arms. 2 red leather straps appeared on each of its arms, wrapping around one of its claws, making this new sub-ancient beast stand out from the rest. Dake. The new sub-beast that appeared from the light of evolution looked at Dake with a hint of pride. Have I become stronger? It asked this question, but it didn't want to get an answer from Dake. Instead, it asked for confirmation. Sub-beast, mutated evolution, sub-beast S. Dake immediately inserted the information into the magic card and looked at it in detail. Card name, sub-beast S. Type, elf card. Level, ****. Race, dragon. Attribute, dragon/fire. Magic power, 1100. Attack, 1500. Defense, 1300. Ultimate skill, small flame, small explosion. It really became a 3-star elf. But its race and attributes didn't change. Its magic power and defense are relatively average among 3-star elves. Only its attack has reached the peak. There are 2 ultimate skills. In addition to the original small flame, there's an additional small explosion. Sub-beast's mutation and evolution was no doubt a pleasant surprise. And since it was already a pleasant surprise, there was no need to worry too much about its strength. Dake had almost no understanding of Sub-Beast S. He could only treat it as a brand new digital beast. But since there was such an evolution step in the middle, it most likely meant that Pride's evolution path wasn't leading to Battle Tyrannosaurus. Although he felt a little disappointed, Dake didn't show it in front of the sub-beast. He continued to look at it. Small explosion. Store small flame in your mouth and spit it out. The power of the explosion is far greater than small flame. I see. Small explosion is an advanced skill of small flame. First, I spit out small flame, then store it in my mouth and combine it with small explosion. Maybe I can achieve a surprise 2-hit combo. Doc couldn't help but glance at the spying magic elves. After they all backed off, Doc ordered Yagu Beast S to release these 2 sure kill skills consecutively on the ground. Boom! Boom! The 2 fireballs exploded one after the other, showing the difference in power between the 2 ultimate skills. Small explosion was much stronger than small flame, in terms of both the central strength and the range of its radiation. After releasing these 2 ultimate skills, Sub-Beast S's fighting spirit was even stronger. It suddenly turned to look at the elves and raised its claws to provoke them. Just as Doc was about to stop them, he saw 2 of the magic elves take half a step forward. Hawkman Wrestling and Demon Fox. They were both 3-star elves, and they both loved to fight. Even the cold Demon Fox was eager to give it a try. Then, Hawkman Wrestling, you can try, but you're not allowed to use your ultimate skills. Tisk. Hatcha. The Demon Fox retracted its foot, but the Hawkman Wrestling couldn't wait to step forward. Roar. Sub-Beast S sneered at the Hawkman Wrestling and hooked its finger. The Hawkman Wrestling's eyes turned cold. The 2 sides hadn't started fighting, but sparks had already been ignited. Dake slowly retreated to the wall and saw Katrina, Deanna, and Luo C poking their heads out because of the explosion. He signaled that everything was fine and leaned against the wall to observe. Sub-Beast S vs. Hawkman Wrestling. However, the duration of this battle was surprisingly short. The Hawkman Wrestling and the Sub-Beast S had a limited difference in their stats, but there was a huge difference in their fighting skills. The Sub-Beast S was a natural warrior, but the Hawkman Wrestling wasn't just a natural warrior. It had also improved. The moment the battle started, the Horned Eagle Man pounced forward. Facing the sharp claws of the Sub-Agu Beast S, it suddenly turned sideways and raised its wings. Its plump feathers were like a curtain that covered the Sub-Agu Beast S's face, blocking its vision in an instant. Then, the Hawkman Wrestling nimbly spun and used its claws to dig into the Sub-Beast S heel, causing it to lose its balance. Then, It used its wings to press down on the sub-beast S, causing it to fall to the ground cleanly. The sub-beast S was knocked down in one move. When the pain from the back of its head traveled to its brain, it suddenly realized that it had been knocked down. Hatcha! The Hawkman wrestler, who had won with one strike, didn't continue to attack. He just spread his wings and retreated in a space glide posture, looking cool and unrestrained. The sub-beast S's little heart was quickly filled with this handsome figure. After it struggled to get up, it suddenly realized something. How was it? This battle? When Dake asked, the sub-beast S immediately patted its chest and said without discouragement, "I'm not strong enough, and I'm not handsome enough." Dake was pleased. Not bad. It's very important to have a clear understanding of your own strength. The sub-beast S clenched its fist and muttered, "So that's how it is. Being strong isn't just about strength. I still have a lot to learn." Dake. To be able to make the Sabegu Beast S say, "There are still many things to learn under pride," the goal of this duel should have been achieved. But why did Dake feel that something was off? He suppressed the strange feeling and took Pride 3 into his hand. After understanding its own shortcomings and learning humility, the sub-ancient Beast S wouldn't be devoured by pride after it evolved further. Dake said to the sub-Beast S, "Prepare for the next round of evolution experiments. This isn't your limit." After hearing this, Yagu Beast S's eyes lit up, then it turned its head to look at the Hawkman. But it immediately turned around and said, "No, the victory won't be a true victory. I can't be blinded by the desire to win." Dake subconsciously wanted to praise the sub-beast S for its extraordinary self-awareness. But before he could say it out loud, for some reason, it was as if a thorn had suddenly grown in his throat, causing him to choke and unable to say anything. He quickly calmed himself down and activated Pride 3. This time, the summoning took a full 5 seconds before the light of Pride 3 was released. The sub-beast S was bathed in the light of Pride 3, and the Pride emblem on its forehead became clearer and brighter. It could feel its emotions become more and more excited, and there was power rolling all over its body. When Pride 3's light was completely absorbed by the emblem, there was an even stronger light of evolution erupting from its body. Its body turned into a luminous body in this strong light, and then it began to grow rapidly. Roar! A roar burst out from the light, and it spread out with a rolling pressure. The luminous body expanded into a very obvious T-Rex shape during the evolution. Dake couldn't help but be surprised. Could it be that it can return to the T-Rex's evolutionary path? He immediately lowered his head and stared closely at the changes on the spell cage, Ancient Beast S magic card. The evolution was complete at this moment. The name on the card also changed from Curse Cage, Ancient Beast S, to Curse Cage, Earth Tyrannosaurus. Earthen T-Rex? Dake frowned. From the name, it should be a subspecies of the T-Rex. This evolutionary path was wrong after all. While he was feeling regretful, he raised his head and looked at the earthen T-Rex that had become bigger and fiercer. From its appearance, the earthen T-Rex was stronger and sturdier than the T-Rex in his impression. It didn't have a wonderful roundness like the T-Rex. However, it also had the same appearance as the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Its head was covered with a hard shell like that of a beetle, and there were L-shaped horns on both sides of the shell. The part that extended to the tip of its nose had an unusually huge horn. Its sharp claws and teeth, and its horns were bigger than the T-Rex's. It was covered in blue stripes, and there were horns on both sides of its shoulders that the T-Rex didn't have. This made the earthen T-Rex look like a terrifying weapon, and it emitted a more violent and ferocious aura. It looks like it has more combat power than the T-Rex. Dake's eyes met the earthen T-Rex's, and he immediately felt the pride and contempt that were condensed in the T-Rex's bones. It was obvious that the earthen T-Rex's modesty before its evolution had been destroyed by Pride 3's effect. Most of the enchanted fairies were like this during their first evolution. However, from the second evolution onward, things would improve a lot. Dake was used to this. He clapped his hands and said calmly, "Earthen T-Rex, sit down." Therefore, the mighty and ferocious T-Rex, which was like a biological weapon, could only sit down obediently. When it felt the coolness of the ground, it seemed to be a little dazed and sat there like a large dinosaur toy. Dake, on the other hand, focused on the enchanted card. Curse Cage, Earthen T-Rex, was an orange card that emitted an orange glow. Card name, Earthen T-Rex. Type, Fairy card. Level, Race, Dragon. Attribute, Dragon/Fire. Magic Power, 2800. Attack, 3000. Defense, 2500. Ultimate Skills, Super Flame, Super Explosion, Giant Horn Attack, 6-star. It's a 6-star enchanted fairy. Dake immediately noticed the Earthen T-Rex's star level. Since the little fiend beast that evolved into a fiend beast was only a 4-star, he was more inclined towards the sub-beast that evolved into a great Earth Tyrannosaurus, should be a 5-star magic guide fairy. However, the Earthen Tyrannosaurus had obviously brought him more surprises. After the 9-tailed fox, he now had another 6-star enchanted fairy. The Earthen T-Rex's race and attributes did not change. Its 3 attributes were very simple, and it was a standard 6-star enchanted fairy card. Its 3 ultimate skills were the same as its 3 attributes, and they were very standard offensive skills. Super Flame shoots out super hot flames from its mouth and burns everything. Super Explosion accumulates the super flame in its mouth and compresses it to the limit to obtain double the explosive power. The first compression takes 3 seconds, the second compression takes 10 seconds, and the third compression takes 30 seconds. The highest power can be increased by 3 times. Giant Horn Attack uses a giant horn to charge forward and pierce through the enemy in front of it. There was nothing difficult to understand. The only thing that needed to be tested was how much the super explosion's power would increase with every compression. If it increased by 50%, then it would be an extremely outstanding ultimate skill. If the ratio was not high enough, then the practicality of the skill would be greatly reduced. After all, in a battle where every second mattered, most of the time, it could only be compressed by 1 level. Compressing it by 3 levels would take 43 seconds, and it would be too late by then. Unfortunately, the current environment was not suitable to test the ultimate skills of a 6-star enchanted fairy. Other than Super Flame and Super Explosion, Earthen Tyrannosaurus' third sure kill skill was pretty decent. Other than being used to charge forward, the Giant Horn Attack could also be used to increase one's speed. Although it was a little embarrassing to use an offensive ultimate skill to escape, it was better to lose face than to lose one's life. Dake patted the Earthen T-Rex's claws to show his satisfaction. Even though the Earthen T-Rex was only an orange card and did not have any special ultimate skills, its overall strength was enough to be considered outstanding among the 6-star enchanted fairy cards. One could not be too greedy. So, next up, Dake looked around and said softly, "Lion Beast, hold the sword." The Lion Beast immediately stepped out, its scabbard following like a shadow. When it held the holy sword, its whole body's aura instantly improved. The Earthen T-Rex, who was sitting on the ground, suddenly turned its head and snorted fiercely at the Lion Beast. 2 wisps of flames came out of its nostrils. 5-star Lion Beast and 6-star Earthen Tyrannosaurus. Just when the 3 club members thought that Dark would let the Lion Beast and the Earthen Tyrannosaurus fight, Dark stopped the Earthen Tyrannosaurus from doing anything. He did not want to cause too much of a ruckus on the spiral clock tower. Even if the clock tower was as indestructible as the castle, it was not a reason to cause a ruckus here. If the club's score was deducted because of this, it would be more unjust than Doe-E. After the enchanted fairy secretary finished scanning the records and the Lion Beast stood at the side with its sword, Dake said to the Earthen T-Rex, "Next, there's another experiment." The Earthen Tyrannosaurus immediately stood up. It could feel how powerful it had become after the successful evolution. If it was not restricted by its master's order, it would only need 3 seconds to kill the Hawkman who defeated it just now. And this was only the result of the second evolution. Each time it evolved, the power it obtained would increase exponentially. If the second evolution was already so powerful, what about the third? The thirst for power and the thirst for victory made the Earthen T-Rex's breathing quicken. So much so that it didn't even hear what its master said next. Stay true to your heart and remember who you are. This is a trial for you, and it might also be the first breakthrough in your life. Doc raised pride after he finished his words. But just as he was about to summon it, he suddenly paused and turned around. Luo C. Sonic Bug. Luo C blinked and took out a magic elf card that she had refined during the holidays. Sonic Bug, a 3-star magic elf. She had summoned it during the Duel Club's recruitment competition. In addition to its own abilities, this magic elf could also work with the Mobius worm's energy scale to recharge the Mobius worm when it wasn't attacked. Apart from that, it also had a sure kill skill, Sound Absorbing Barrier. Luo C had once used Sound Absorbing Barrier to cut off the sound in a small area during a duel, so that the opponent's commands could not be transmitted to the magic elf's ears, creating a good opportunity to deal a fatal blow. A moment later, the Sonic Bug created a spherical, sound-absorbing barrier around the empty space surrounding it. Doc nodded in satisfaction and raised pride again. Summon. Almost at the same time, he began to retreat, making space for the lion beast. The lion, who had already understood, immediately unsheathed its sword and gathered its aura. The earthen T-Rex was stimulated and immediately became alert. But Pride's radiance had already scattered. The magic elves quietly walked out from various passages, all waiting solemnly. The little fiend flapped its wings and stared at the earthen T-Rex. As a familiar, it always had a competitive mentality. Now that the earthen T-Rex was so much stronger than the fiend it had evolved into, it felt jealous. Education could change people, but a leopard never changes its spots was no joke. It cursed the earthen Tyrannosaurus in its heart. Fail, fail, fail. It was unknown if the little fiend's curse had come true. Under the light of pride, the earthen Tyrannosaurus underwent a drastic change. It was more dangerous and faster than the little fiend's wrong evolution. The black light that symbolized evil and the golden light that symbolized light had an extremely intense conflict from the beginning. Later on, the golden light gained the upper hand, but the black light was not nibbled away. Instead, it went berserk like a broken jar. The earthen T-Rex let out a painful roar during the evolution process. The high decibel sound was isolated by the sound-absorbing barrier. It obviously did not remember Dake's words and was swallowed by the darkness without warning. It did not need the guidance of other magic cards. There was also no spiritual power involved. It was as if this pride card was extremely compatible with it. The earthen T-Rex completed its wrong evolution at an extremely fast speed. That familiar, ferocious, zombie Tyrannosaurus, which was only left with pale white bones, brought with it endless terror as it descended. Afterward, it was destroyed by the lion with 2 slashes. 7-star, the zombie T-Rex and the little fiend's evolution are exactly the same. Dake picked up the magic card. The sub-ancient beast in the curse cage had already returned to its original form. But it is more violent and harder to communicate with. 5 in 1 10,000 plus. Requesting votes, asterisk, O, equals Omega, smiley face M. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.